The woman had no name when they brought her in. Not because she didn't have one, but because she couldn't speak it. Her jaw was slack, her eyes half open, her breathing so shallow that the triage nurse almost sent her straight to resuscitation. But it wasn't her breathing that made Dr. Samuel Ocasio stop mid-step in the corridor of Temple University Hospital. It was her arm. The skin from her wrist to her elbow had turned black, not bruised, not burned. Black in the way that only dead tissue turns, a matte, almost velvet darkness where living flesh should have been. Beneath that layer, something worse was visible. The tissue had begun to separate. Muscle fibres, normally hidden deep beneath skin and fat, were exposed to the open air, glistening under the fluorescent lights of the emergency department. A smell hit the team before they even pulled back the gauze she'd wrapped around it. A thick, sour odour that veteran ER nurses, people who had seen gunshot wounds and gangrenous feet and third-degree burns, would later say was unlike anything in their careers. Dr. Ocasio had been working emergency medicine in Philadelphia for 11 years. He had treated overdoses in the hundreds: heroin, fentanyl, methamphetamine, cocaine cut with levamisole that ate through people's earlobes and cheeks. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. He thought he had seen the full catalogue of what drugs could do to a human body. He was wrong. Because the wound on this woman's arm was not caused by infection. It was not caused by a dirty needle, or by missing the vein, or by any of the usual complications of injection drug use that fill emergency rooms in every American city. The lab results, when they came back 40 minutes later, confirmed what Ocasio had already begun to suspect. Her blood contained fentanyl. That was expected. But alongside it was something else, a compound called Xylazine, a drug not made for humans, a drug designed, tested, and approved exclusively for sedating horses, cattle, and deer. A veterinary tranquilizer was circulating through this woman's bloodstream, and it was eating her alive from the inside out. Ocasio ordered an IV drip, broad-spectrum antibiotics, and an emergency surgical consult. The surgeon who examined the arm estimated that 40% of the tissue between the wrist and elbow was already necrotic, dead beyond any possibility of recovery. The question was no longer how to heal the wound. The question was how much of the arm could be saved. That alone would have made this a remarkable case. One patient, one catastrophic wound, one night in one emergency room in one city. Except it wasn't one patient. In the beds around her, that same night, 3 other people had come in with similar wounds. One on a shin, one on the top of a foot, one on the soft tissue of a neck just below the jaw. All of them tested positive for the same combination, fentanyl and xylazine. All of them had tissue that was dying or already dead. 2 of them said they had never even heard the word xylazine. They didn't know what was in the drugs they were buying. They only knew the street name, a word that had started circulating through Kensington and North Philadelphia sometime in the previous 2 years, whispered among users with a mix of desire and dread. Tranq. They called it tranq dope. The bags looked the same as every other bag of fentanyl sold on the corners along Kensington Avenue. Tiny wax paper envelopes, sometimes stamped with a brand logo, sometimes blank. There was no label, no warning, no way to tell by sight or by smell whether the powder inside contained just fentanyl or fentanyl laced with a sedative potent enough to drop a 1,200-pound horse. By 2023, the answer was almost always both. Data from Philadelphia's Department of Public Health painted a picture that was hard to process. In samples tested from the city's drug supply, xylazine appeared in nearly 90% of the fentanyl being sold on the streets, 9 out of 10 bags. This was not a rare contaminant. This was not an occasional bad batch. Xylazine had become the default ingredient in Philadelphia's fentanyl supply, as standard and expected as the fentanyl itself, and most of the people injecting it had no idea. The wounds had a pattern that separated them from anything else in medical literature. They did not only appear at injection sites. A person could inject into a vein in their arm and develop necrotic tissue on their leg, their torso, their face. The drug seemed to attack the body's smallest blood vessels from the inside, strangling the blood supply to the skin wherever it was most vulnerable. Gravity played a role, so did circulation, so did factors that researchers even now do not fully understand. One woman developed a wound on her breast. She had never injected anywhere near it. The xylazine found its own targets. Dr. Ocasio started keeping a count. In January 2023, he personally treated 14 patients with xylazine-related wounds in a single week. By March, the number had risen to 22 per week. By summer, he had lost count. His phone's photo gallery, once filled with pictures of his 2 daughters at the park, now contained hundreds of clinical images: arms, legs, hands, feet, all in various stages of tissue death. He showed them at a medical conference in Baltimore. A surgeon in the audience left the room. But the wounds were only half of the crisis. The other half was something that paramedics and first responders discovered in real time, on sidewalks and in alleys, in gas station bathrooms and in the back seats of parked cars. When a person overdoses on an opioid like heroin or fentanyl, there is a tool that can reverse it. Naloxone, sold under the brand name Narcan, is an opioid antagonist. It binds to the same receptors in the brain that opioids attach to, and it blocks them. Administer it in time, and the person wakes up. Naloxone has saved tens of thousands of lives since it entered widespread use. First responders carry it. Parents of people who use drugs carry it. Strangers on the street in cities like Philadelphia carry it in their jacket pockets, just in case. Naloxone works on opioids. Xylazine is not an opioid. That fact, 7 words long, rearranged the entire landscape of overdose response in the United States. When a person collapses from a combination of fentanyl and xylazine, naloxone can reverse the fentanyl. But the xylazine continues to suppress their breathing, slow their heart rate, and drag them toward death through a mechanism that naloxone cannot touch. First responders began reporting cases where they administered naloxone, 1 dose, then 2, then 3, then 4, and the person remained unresponsive. Their breathing stayed shallow. Their lips stayed blue. The one tool that stood between overdose and death, the single intervention that every harm reduction organization in the country had spent years distributing, training people to use, fighting to make available without prescription. That tool now had a gap in it wide enough for people to die through. They were dying through it. Across Philadelphia, across the Northeast, and increasingly in cities as far apart as San Francisco and Baltimore and Houston and Detroit, people were dying of overdoses that naloxone should have reversed. Bystanders who administered it correctly, who did everything right, who held the person and breathed for them and called 911 and waited. Those bystanders watched people die anyway. Some of them would carry that for years, the guilt of doing everything they were trained to do and having it not be enough. Doctor. Ocasio stood in the hallway of Temple University Hospital at 2 a.m, waiting for the surgical team to finish their initial debridement of the woman's arm. The fluorescent light above him buzzed with a faint, irregular flicker. He had been on shift for 14 hours. Down the hall, a security guard was talking to a man who had walked into the ER barefoot, asking for wound care supplies. In the waiting room, a woman with a bandage around her ankle sat perfectly still, staring at a television that was turned off. This was a Tuesday, an ordinary Tuesday in Kensington. and Ocasio already knew, with the certainty of a man who had watched a crisis build in slow motion for 3 years, that tomorrow would be worse. What he didn't yet know, what almost no one outside a small circle of researchers and street-level outreach workers understood in those early months of 2023, was how this had happened. How a drug made for animals had found its way into the most vulnerable veins in America. Who had put it there? Why it spread so fast? And why, even as the bodies piled up and the amputations multiplied and the ER waiting rooms overflowed, the people with the power to act were looking the other way. The woman in the ER bed still had no name in the system. She had been registered as a Jane Doe. Somewhere in the folds of her jacket, which a nurse had placed in a plastic bag beneath the gurney, there was an ID. It would be found later. It would tell them her name, her age, her address, all the details that turn a body back into a person. But by then, the surgeons would already be deciding how much of her arm to remove. And 3 blocks away, on the corner of Kensington and Allegheny, a new shipment of wax paper bags was being divided into smaller bundles for the morning rush. The stamp on this batch was a small cartoon crown. Inside was fentanyl. Inside was xylazine. And the first buyers were already lining up in the dark, waiting for the sun to come up, waiting for the sellers to arrive, not knowing, or perhaps knowing and no longer caring, what the powder would do once it entered their blood and began its work on the tissue beneath their skin, the tissue they could not see, the tissue that was already in so many of them beginning to die. Nobody told them, nobody was required to, and almost nobody with the authority to intervene was paying attention. That was about to change, but not fast enough. Not nearly fast enough for Marco Reyes, a 34-year-old father who lived 11 blocks from that corner, and who, at that exact moment, was staring at a dark spot on his forearm that hadn't been there a week ago. A spot he told himself was just a bruise, just a shadow, just nothing. It was not nothing. Kensington used to make things. That was the single fact that older residents repeated when anyone asked what had happened to the neighbourhood, as if the answer to everything that came after could be traced back to the moment the factories closed. In the 1950s, more than 30 textile mills operated within a 12-block radius. The area produced so much fabric, curtains, upholstery, rugs, industrial cloth, that people called it the textile capital of the world. Workers walked to their shifts. They bought houses on the same streets where their parents had bought houses. The bars on Kensington Avenue served beer at lunch to men whose hands were still stained with dye, and nobody thought twice about it. By 1975, most of the mills were gone. The jobs went to the American South first, then overseas, following the logic of cheaper labour that would repeat itself across every industrial neighbourhood in the country over the next 4 decades. The row houses stayed. The people stayed, at least those who couldn't afford to leave. But the economic floor beneath them had been pulled away, and what filled the gap was predictable to anyone who has studied how neighbourhoods collapse. Poverty arrived first, then the drugs. Heroin came through Kensington in the late 1960s and early 1970s, part of the same wave that swept through Harlem and the South Bronx and the west side of Baltimore. Crack cocaine hit in the mid-1980s. Prescription opioids flooded in during the late 1990s and 2000s, pushed by pharmaceutical companies that marketed pills like OxyContin to doctors as safe, effective, and low risk for addiction. When the prescriptions tightened, people who had become dependent switched to heroin, which was cheaper and easier to find on the street. When heroin became unreliable, fentanyl, a synthetic opioid 50 times stronger, replaced it. Each wave was worse than the one before. Each one killed more people, faster, with less warning. Kensington absorbed every single wave. The neighbourhood became synonymous with open-air drug markets, with rows of people slumped against storefronts, with overdose counts that made national news. Television crews flew in from New York and Los Angeles to film the same 3 blocks, broadcast the same images, and leave. Nothing changed after they left. The people on those blocks remained. Marco Reyes was born on one of those blocks in 1989. His mother, Lucia, had come to Philadelphia from Bayamon, Puerto Rico in 1983, following a cousin who said there was work in a garment factory on North Front Street. The factory closed 2 years after she arrived. She found work cleaning offices downtown, catching the bus at 5 in the morning, coming home after dark. Marco's father left before Marco turned 3. The only evidence he had ever existed in the household was a Philadelphia Eagles cap on the top shelf of the hallway closet that Lucia never threw away and Marco never asked about. Marco was the younger of 2 brothers. Tomas, 4 years older, was the one who found trouble first. By 15, Tomas was running with a crew that sold small quantities of heroin near the McPherson Square L station. By 18, he was using what he sold. Marco watched this happen the way a child watches weather. Something large and dangerous moving across the sky. Impossible to control, impossible to ignore. He saw his brother's face thin out. He saw the locked bathroom door. He heard his mother on the phone with the parish priest at 3 in the morning, her voice low and cracked. Marco decided, at an age when most children are deciding what sport to play, that he would not follow Tomas. He held to that decision with a stubbornness that carried him through high school, through a job at a grocery store, through an apprenticeship with a small construction crew that did concrete work and masonry in the neighbourhoods around Kensington. He was not a star. He was not exceptional. He was a man who showed up, did his work and went home. At 26, he had a daughter, Isabella. Her mother, a woman named Carmen who worked at a laundromat on Lehigh Avenue, moved out when Isabella was 2. Custody was shared. Every other weekend, Marco would pick Isabella up from Carmen's apartment, carry her on his shoulders to the playground at McPherson Square, and buy her a cherry water ice from the cart on the corner. Those weekends were the architecture of his life. Everything else, the early mornings, the dust in his lungs from cutting concrete, the ache in his lower back that started at 29 and never fully went away. All of it was built around those Saturdays. He lived in a second-floor apartment on East Haggart Street, 3 rooms, a bathroom with a window that didn't close all the way. The rent was $800 a month. He could make it most months. Some months he couldn't. On the block below his window, he could see the foot traffic that every Kensington resident learned to read, the quick walks, the brief stops, the hand-to-hand exchanges that happened in plain sight. He knew what it was. He stepped around it every morning on his way to the bus stop the way a person steps around a puddle. It was part of the landscape. It had been part of the landscape for his entire life. This was Marco Reyes in 2017, 34 years old, a daughter he loved, a body that worked but was starting to wear, a brother who drifted in and out of shelters and halfway houses, a neighbourhood that the rest of the city had given up on long ago. He had no idea what Xylazine was. The word meant nothing to him. It meant nothing to almost anyone outside of veterinary medicine. But that was about to change. Not because anyone in Kensington went looking for the drug, but because the drug came looking for them. And to understand how, the story has to leave Philadelphia entirely and travel 1,500 miles southeast across open ocean to an island where the marriage between Xylazine and the street drug supply had already been consummated years earlier, quietly, with consequences that should have served as a warning to every public health official on the mainland. Puerto Rico knew about Xylazine. Puerto Rico had been trying to tell people for over a decade. In the early 2000s, doctors in San Juan and Bayamon began noticing something unusual in patients who came to emergency rooms after overdoses. The toxicology screens were showing a compound that didn't belong in any recreational drug, Xylazine, a sedative used by veterinarians to calm large animals before surgery. At first, clinicians assumed it was an anomaly, a contaminated batch, a mistake. But the numbers kept rising. By 2005, Xylazine was appearing in a significant portion of heroin samples tested on the island. By 2010, it was almost everywhere. Puerto Rican drug users had a name for the combination long before anyone in Philadelphia had heard the word tranq. They called it anesthesia. How did an animal tranquilizer end up in the heroin supply of a Caribbean island? The answer was disturbingly simple. Xylazine was easy to get. In Puerto Rico, as in much of the United States, it was available through veterinary supply chains without significant regulation. A person with basic knowledge of the industry could purchase it legally. It came in liquid form, in small bottles that cost a few dollars each. Dealers discovered that adding it to heroin extended the duration of the high. Users stayed sedated longer, felt the effects more deeply, and came back sooner for more. It was a product enhancement, a competitive advantage in a crowded market. Puerto Rican researchers sounded alarms. Studies were published. Data was presented at conferences. Dr. Ivalice Ramos, a toxicologist in San Juan, co-authored papers documenting the rise of xylazine in the island's drug supply and the unusual wounds that accompanied it. She sent her findings to federal health agencies. The response was minimal. Puerto Rico was treated, as it often was in matters of public health, as a peripheral concern, an island problem, geographically and politically distant from the mainland. The drug didn't stay on the island. The cultural and familial ties between Puerto Rico and Philadelphia are among the strongest of any migration corridor in the United States. Families move back and forth. Neighborhoods overlap. The same last names appear on mailboxes in Bayamon and on Kensington Avenue. When the technique of cutting heroin and later fentanyl with xylazine migrated to Philadelphia, it traveled along these connections, not as a conspiracy, not as a cartel directive, but as knowledge, a method, a recipe that dealers in one place shared with dealers in another because it worked. By 2018, xylazine was showing up in Philadelphia's drug supply with increasing regularity. By 2019, it was in the majority of tested samples. And by 2020, the year the world locked down for a pandemic, and the country's attention turned entirely elsewhere, xylazine had become so embedded in Kensington's fentanyl that buying a bag without it was nearly impossible. Marco Reyes, in the spring of 2018, knew none of this. He knew that his back hurt. He knew that the pain had been getting worse for months, a deep ache in his lower spine that radiated down his left leg and made it difficult to bend, to lift, to do the work that paid his rent. He knew that a doctor at an urgent care clinic had prescribed him 30 Percocet tablets and told him to rest for 2 weeks. He knew that the tablets worked, that for the first time in months, the pain receded enough for him to sleep through the night. He also knew that after the 30 tablets were gone, the doctor would not prescribe more. Insurance wouldn't cover a specialist. Physical therapy was $70 a session. The construction crew had already replaced him with someone else. On a Thursday evening in June, Tomas showed up at Marco's apartment. He hadn't called ahead. His clothes were clean, his eyes were clear, and he was carrying a 6-pack of beer. They sat on the front stoop and watched the street. At some point, Tomas mentioned that he knew where to get something that would help with the pain. Cheap. Stronger than the pills. Available right now. No prescription, no clinic, no waiting. Marco knew what his brother was offering. He had spent his entire adult life not taking it. 34 years of stepping around the puddle. He said yes. And inside the small wax paper bag that Tomas placed in his hand that night, stamped with the logo of a blue diamond sold for $10 on a corner Marco had walked past 10,000 times, there was fentanyl. and mixed in with the fentanyl, invisible, odorless, undetectable without a laboratory, there was something else. Something that, at that very moment, was already beginning to dissolve the boundary between Marco Reyes and the worst medical crisis his neighbourhood had ever seen. The first time was nothing like Marco expected. He had spent his whole life imagining that using would feel like falling, a loss of control, a plunge into something dark and immediate. Instead, it felt like warmth, a slow, heavy warmth that started in his chest and radiated outward through his limbs, dissolving the pain in his lower back the way hot water dissolves salt. The ache that had kept him awake for months simply stopped. Not dulled, not masked. Gone. His muscles unclenched, his jaw loosened. He sat on the edge of his bed and felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, like his body was not his enemy. He told himself it was medicine. Different delivery method, same purpose. Managing pain. He would do this until he could afford to see a specialist, until the construction crew called him back, until his back healed on its own. 2 weeks, maybe 3. 3 months later, he was buying 2 bags a day. The progression followed a path so well documented by addiction researchers that it could almost be plotted on a graph. Tolerance built within days. The dose that erased his pain on a Thursday barely touched it by the following Monday. He needed more. The intervals between doses shortened. The hours between the last high wearing off and the next purchase narrowed until there was almost no gap at all. Just a continuous cycle of use, brief relief, mounting sickness, and the frantic scramble to use again. But something else was happening inside Marco's body that he had no framework to understand. The fentanyl was building one kind of dependence, opioid receptors in his brain reshaping themselves around the drug's presence, demanding it, punishing him with nausea and cramps and bone-deep restlessness when it was absent. The xylazine, meanwhile, was building a second dependence entirely, a parallel track. His central nervous system was adapting to the constant sedation of an alpha-2 adrenergic agonist, a class of drug that operates through completely different neurochemistry than opioids. 2 chains, not one. And Marco didn't even know the second chain existed. Nobody told him. Not the people he bought from, not the other users on the block, not the sparse medical infrastructure available to uninsured men in Kensington. The word xylazine never entered his vocabulary. He knew only that the high felt different from what he'd heard heroin was supposed to feel like. Deeper, heavier, longer. He assumed it was just fentanyl being fentanyl. Powerful stuff. That was the whole explanation he gave himself, and it was enough to keep him from asking questions. Meanwhile, 1,500 miles away, the answers to those unasked questions had already been written. In morgue reports, in published research papers, in data sets that sat in academic databases like unread letters. Puerto Rico's experience with Xylazine was not a secret. It was simply ignored. The first documented cases appeared on the island around 2001. By 2004, Dr. Ivelis Ramos and a team of toxicologists at the Puerto Rico Institute of Forensic Sciences had identified xylazine in the blood of overdose victims at rates that defied coincidence. They weren't finding trace amounts. In some samples, xylazine concentrations were high enough to have contributed directly to the cause of death. These were young people, men and women in their 20s and 30s, found in apartments, in cars, on sidewalks, whose deaths had been attributed to heroin overdoses until someone thought to run a wider toxicology panel. Dr. Ramos published her findings. She presented at conferences in San Juan and in the mainland United States. She co-authored papers with titles that practically screamed the urgency of what she was seeing. The data was clear, well documented and publicly available. Almost nobody on the mainland paid attention. There is a particular kind of institutional neglect that applies to Puerto Rico, a territory of the United States whose residents are American citizens, but whose problems are treated by federal agencies and mainland media alike as foreign. When Hurricane Maria devastated the island in 2017, the inadequacy of the federal response became international news. But the Xylazine crisis on the island, which had been building for over a decade by then, never reached that level of visibility. It was a slow-motion disaster affecting people who used drugs, on an island that the mainland already struggled to see clearly. The research existed. The warnings were filed. The filing cabinets stayed closed. What migrated was not the drug itself. Xylazine was already available throughout the mainland United States, sitting on shelves in veterinary supply warehouses from Pennsylvania to Texas. What migrated was the knowledge of what to do with it. The connection between Puerto Rico and Philadelphia is one of the oldest and densest migration corridors in the Caribbean diaspora. More than 200,000 Puerto Ricans live in the Philadelphia metropolitan area. Kensington, in particular, has been a landing point for Puerto Rican families since the 1950s. The bodegas on Kensington Avenue stock Goya products and play reggaeton through open doors. Spanish is spoken as commonly as English on many blocks. Families maintain ties across the ocean, visiting, calling, sending money, sharing news. Among those connections, at some point in the mid-2000s, the recipe travelled. A dealer in Philadelphia learned from a contact in Puerto Rico, or from someone who had recently arrived from the island, or from someone who had heard it third hand, that adding xylazine to fentanyl created a better product. Better not in any medical sense. Better in the sense that mattered to the market. Customers stayed high longer, came back more often, and became dependent faster. This was not an accident. It was not carelessness. It was not a manufacturing error at some distant lab. The addition of xylazine to the fentanyl supply was a deliberate, economically rational decision made by people who sold drugs for profit. They were solving a business problem. Fentanyl is extraordinarily potent, but its effects are short-lived. A high that peaks and fades within an hour or two. Users burn through their supply quickly, which means more transactions, more exposure, more risk for both buyer and seller. Xylazine extended the duration of the high by hours. One bag now did what 2 bags used to do. Customers were satisfied. They were also becoming dependent on a substance their bodies had never evolved to process, but that was not the seller's concern. The economics were irresistible. Xylazine, purchased in bulk from chemical suppliers in China and India, cost as little as $6 per kilogram. A single kilogram could adulterate thousands of doses. The profit margin was almost incomprehensible. A few dollars of raw material translating into tens of thousands of dollars in street sales. No other cutting agent offered this combination of cheapness, availability, and pharmacological effect. Dealers who used xylazine had a competitive advantage over those who didn't. Market pressure did the rest. By 2018, the year Marco Reyes made his first purchase on that corner near his apartment, the transformation of Philadelphia's fentanyl supply was already well underway. Testing data from the city's forensic labs showed xylazine prevalence climbing, 20%, then 40%, then 60%. Each quarter, the number rose. Each quarter, the bags on the street became more likely to contain the animal tranquilizer. And each quarter, the people buying those bags had less and less chance of knowing what they were putting into their veins. Marco fell into a rhythm. Mornings were the worst. He would wake with his sheets damp, his muscles contracting in waves, his stomach clenched so tight he couldn't eat. The sickness came on faster each week. At first he could go 12 hours between doses, then 8, then 6. By the autumn of 2018, he was setting an alarm for 4 in the morning so he could use before the withdrawal peaked. The alarm tone, a default chime on his prepaid phone, became the sound his body associated with relief. He would hear it, and his hands would already be reaching for the small kit he kept beneath his mattress. He stopped picking up Isabella on weekends. He told Carmen his back was too bad, that he was seeing a doctor, that he needed a few weeks to recover. Carmen didn't push. She may have known, she may not have. The phone calls between them grew shorter, spaced further apart, until they communicated only by text. Brief, practical messages about Isabella's school schedule and clothing sizes. Marco read every message. He responded to about half. His savings evaporated within the first 2 months. He sold his tools, a concrete saw, a trowel set, a level that had belonged to his foreman, for a fraction of their value. He borrowed money from Tomas, who had somehow come into a stretch of relative stability, working part-time at a warehouse in Port Richmond. The irony was total. The brother who had introduced him to the drug was now lending him money to keep using it. Tomas said nothing about this arrangement. He simply handed Marco folded 20s and looked away. By early 2019, Marco was spending between $40 and $60 a day. His rent fell behind. The landlord left notices on his door, first polite, then formal, then threatening. In March, he came home to find the lock changed. His clothes were in 2 garbage bags on the sidewalk. The eagle's cap from the hallway closet was not among them. He slept that night under the overpass at Lehigh Avenue, on a piece of flattened cardboard, with 3 bags of tranq dope tucked into his sock. The April air was 41 degrees. He used 2 of the bags before midnight and felt nothing except the absence of pain, which at that point was indistinguishable from happiness. Somewhere in his body, in the capillaries of his forearm, in the small vessels feeding the skin of his hands and feet, in the tissue that would one day turn black and split open under the fluorescent lights of an emergency room, the Xylazine was doing what it does, constricting blood flow, starving cells of oxygen, beginning a process that would not become visible for months but that had, in a biological sense, already started. Marco could not feel it. He could not see it. The only thing he noticed on that first night without a roof was that the high lasted longer than it used to. He interpreted this as good news. 11 blocks south, Dr. Samuel Ocasio was finishing a double shift at Temple University Hospital. He had treated 4 overdoses that evening. 3 of them had responded to naloxone. The 4th had required mechanical ventilation and was still in the ICU, breathing through a tube, unresponsive to anything. The toxicology report on that patient would come back in the morning. Ocasio didn't know it yet, but that report would contain a word he was about to see hundreds of times over the next 4 years, a word that would reshape his career, his sleep patterns, and his understanding of what a drug crisis could look like when nobody was watching. The report would say Xylazine, and nothing in his 11 years of emergency medicine had prepared him for what that word was about to mean. The day starts before the sun. Not by choice. The body decides. Around 4 or 5 in the morning, the first wave hits, a crawling sensation beneath the skin, as if every nerve is being dragged in a different direction. Muscles seize in the calves and lower back. The stomach cramps hard enough to double a person over. Sweat breaks through skin that is simultaneously freezing cold. This is withdrawal, and for someone dependent on both fentanyl and xylazine, it arrives on 2 fronts at once. The opioid withdrawal brings the pain, the nausea, the restlessness so severe that lying still feels like being buried alive. The xylazine withdrawal adds something different, a surging anxiety that sits in the chest like a fist, a heart rate that spikes without warning, and in severe cases tremors that make it impossible to hold a needle steady. Marco learned to use before the worst of it arrived. His hands would shake less at 4:30 than at 5. This was the calculus of his mornings, a narrow window between the first stirrings of sickness and the point where his body became too unstable to function. He kept his kit in a cloth pouch tucked into the waistband of his jeans while he slept. Needle, cooker, cotton filter, a small piece of rubber tubing he used as a tourniquet, water in a plastic bottle cap. These items never left his body. Losing them would mean enduring the full onset of withdrawal while trying to replace them, and that was a scenario he could not afford. The morning shot brought relief in under 30 seconds. The fentanyl hit first, a rush that started behind the eyes and cascaded downward. Then the xylazine followed, slower, heavier, like a blanket being lowered over the entire nervous system. His heart rate dropped. His breathing slowed. The anxiety that had been screaming in his chest went quiet. His body, which moments before had been a machine tearing itself apart, became still. This was the pull. Not pleasure, not euphoria, stillness. People who have never experienced opioid dependence often assume the attraction is about getting high, about chasing some ecstatic state. For most long-term users, that phase ends within the first weeks or months. What remains is something more fundamental, the need to feel normal, to stop the sickness, to reach a baseline that non-dependent people inhabit every moment of every day without ever thinking about it. The high, if it came at all anymore, lasted minutes. The relief lasted hours. That was what Marco was buying each morning on the corner of Kensington and Somerset. Not a high. A pause. By mid-2019, he had settled into the geography of Kensington's open-air drug market, with the familiarity of a commuter learning a new transit route. The market operated across a roughly 10-block stretch centred on Kensington Avenue, between Allegheny and Lehigh. Sellers worked in shifts, stationed at specific corners, identifiable by the brand stamps on their bags. Buyers formed loose, shifting lines that moved quickly. A transaction took less than 15 seconds. Cash in one hand, bags in the other, eye contact minimal. The whole operation functioned with a mechanical efficiency that would have impressed a logistics consultant. The police presence was sporadic and largely symbolic. Patrol cars rolled through at predictable intervals. Arrests happened, but they were almost always of low-level buyers or street-level sellers who were replaced within hours. The supply chain above them, the people who imported the fentanyl, who mixed it with xylazine, who distributed it in bulk to the corner crews, operated at a distance that street-level enforcement rarely reached. The market adapted to disruption the way water adapts to a stone dropped in a river. It closed around it and kept moving. Marco found his corner. The seller there used a stamp of a small blue star. The bags were consistent. Same strength, same duration, same effect. In a supply where variation could mean death, consistency was the most valuable quality a product could have. Marco bought from the same spot every day, sometimes twice. He recognized the other regulars. They recognized him. There was no friendship in this, but there was a mutual awareness, a silent registry of faces that meant belonging. It was on this corner, in the autumn of 2019, that he first noticed Nina Delgado. She was standing apart from the line, leaning against the wall of a shuttered check cashing store. Her weight shifted onto her right leg. Her left ankle was wrapped in a bandage that had gone grey with street dirt. She was thin in the way that long-term stimulant and opioid use makes people thin, not just underweight but reduced, as if the body had been pared down to only its most essential structures. Her hair was pulled back. Her eyes were open but unfocused, fixed on a point somewhere in the middle distance. She was in the tranq. The tranq was Kensington's most visible signature. Xylazine's sedative effects caused users to lose consciousness, while still technically standing. Their bodies would bend forward at the waist, sometimes nearly touching the ground, held upright only by locked knees and the slow-motion physics of balance. They could remain in this position for hours. Passers-by on Kensington Avenue walked around them. Television cameras filmed them. The images circulated on social media, shared thousands of times, stripped of context, turned into spectacle. What the cameras didn't capture was the pharmacology behind the posture, a veterinary tranquilizer suppressing the central nervous system to the point where the brain could no longer hold the body upright, but not quite far enough to trigger a full collapse. Nina came out of it slowly, the way a person surfaces from deep water. She straightened, blinked, looked around. Her hand went immediately to her ankle. She adjusted the bandage without looking at it, a gesture so practiced it was clearly something she did many times a day. Marco would later learn her story in fragments, the way people in Kensington learned most things about each other, not through long conversations but through accumulated details, overheard remarks, and the slow accumulation of presence. Nina was 28. She'd grown up in a town called Oneonta in upstate New York, a place she described to other people on the block as boring and green. She had come to Philadelphia at 22, following a boyfriend who had a cousin with an apartment in Fishtown. The boyfriend left within a year. Nina stayed. Something had happened to her. The other women on the block referred to it obliquely, protectively, never with full detail. And the drugs followed that event the way infection follows a wound. She'd been in Kensington for 4 years by the time Marco first saw her leaning against that wall. They did not become a couple. They became something harder to name. Two people who occupied the same stretch of sidewalk, who noticed when the other didn't show up, who shared information about which bags were strong and which were weak, who carried naloxone for each other, even though both of them knew, by that point, that naloxone might not be enough. Nina knew about Xylazine. She was one of the few users Marco encountered who actually used the word. She had learned it from a harm reduction outreach worker who came through the block every Wednesday in a white van, distributing clean needles, wound care kits, naloxone, fentanyl test strips, and, increasingly, Xylazine test strips. Nina took the strips but rarely used them. The knowledge of what was in the bags didn't change the calculus. She needed the bags regardless. Testing them would only confirm what she already assumed, that everything on the street now contained tranq, that there was no fentanyl-only option available, that the choice was not between a clean supply and a contaminated one, but between using what existed and enduring withdrawal. She chose to use. Every day she chose it again, not because she was unaware of the risks, but because the alternative, the dual withdrawal, the anxiety, the seizure risk, the pain, was, in the immediate mathematics of her body, worse. Her ankle told a different story. Beneath the grey bandage, the skin had begun to change. It started as a discoloration, a dark patch no larger than a thumbprint, slightly warm to the touch. Nina mentioned it to a woman she sometimes stayed with, describing it as a bruise she didn't remember getting. Over the weeks that followed, the patch darkened, the edges hardened. A small crack appeared in the centre, like dry earth splitting in summer heat. Fluid wept from the crack, not blood, but a thin yellowish discharge that stained her sock and smelled faintly of something organic and wrong. She wrapped it tighter. She changed the bandage when the harm reduction van came through. She applied antibiotic ointment from a tube that Elena, the outreach worker, pressed into her hand every Wednesday with increasing urgency. Elena told her to go to the hospital. Nina shook her head. She had been to emergency rooms before. She'd been made to wait for hours in hallways while staff moved around her as if she were furniture. She had been discharged with prescriptions she couldn't fill, and instructions to follow up with doctors who wouldn't see her without insurance. The medical system, in Nina's experience, was a place that processed people like her without ever actually seeing them. So the wound grew, slowly, Almost imperceptibly, the necrosis expanded outward from that original dark patch. The dead tissue spread concentrically, claiming healthy skin millimetre by millimetre, the way a stain spreads through cloth. Beneath the surface, the xylazine was doing what researchers were just beginning to document, constricting the microvasculature, choking off blood supply to the tissue, creating ischemia in areas that had no direct contact with the injection site. Nina injected in her arms. The wound was on her ankle. The drug travelled through her bloodstream and attacked wherever it found vulnerability. She could not feel it getting worse. The xylazine numbed the area. This was perhaps the cruelest feature of the drug's pathology. It destroyed tissue and simultaneously prevented the person from feeling the destruction. Pain is the body's alarm system. Xylazine disconnected it. By the time a wound became painful enough to demand attention, the necrosis was often so advanced that the underlying muscle and even bone were already compromised. Nina's ankle didn't hurt. The bandage hid what was underneath. She adjusted it without looking, the way a person adjusts a watch strap or a sleeve. A reflex, an accommodation, a small automatic gesture that concealed something she was not yet ready to see. 3 blocks north, in his own spot beneath the overpass, Marco was looking at his forearm. The dark spot he had first noticed weeks ago had changed. It was larger now, roughly the size of a quarter, and the skin at its centre had taken on a texture he didn't recognise. Not smooth, not scarred. Something between leather and paper, as if the tissue had been drained of everything that made it alive. He pressed it with his thumb. No pain, no sensation at all, just a dull, dead absence where feeling should have been. He wrapped it with a strip of cloth torn from a t-shirt and pulled his sleeve down over it. The morning line was forming on the corner. The Blue Star bags would be out soon. The sun was just clearing the roofline of the abandoned mill on Jasper Street, casting long shadows across the pavement, where 12 people stood in various stages of sickness, waiting for the only thing that would make the next few hours bearable. Marco joined the line. Nina was already there, weight on her right leg, hand resting lightly on her wrapped ankle, eyes scanning the corner for the first seller of the day. Neither of them looked at their wounds. Neither of them spoke about what was underneath the bandages. Between the two of them, in the hidden geography beneath cloth and gauze and denial, the tissue was dying at a pace that would, within months, force decisions neither of them was prepared to make. Decisions measured not in bags or dollars, but in centimetres of flesh, in the distance between a wound that could heal and one that had passed the point where healing was still possible. The seller arrived. The line moved forward. The day began. The skin split on a Monday. Marco was sitting on a milk crate behind the abandoned furniture store on Gurney Street, rolling up his sleeve to inject when he saw it. The dark patch on his forearm, the one he had been covering, ignoring, explaining away for weeks, had cracked open along its centre. The edges of the crack curled slightly upward, like peeling paint, revealing a layer beneath that was wet and pale yellow. It didn't bleed. Healthy tissue bleeds. This tissue had no blood supply left to give. He stared at it for a long time. Then he pulled the tourniquet tight above his elbow, found a vein on the opposite arm and used. The high erased the next 3 hours. When he came back to awareness, slumped against the wall with his chin on his chest, the wound was still there. It had not been a hallucination. It had not been a trick of the early morning light. The skin on his forearm was dying, and whatever was beneath it was now exposed to the air, to the dirt on his hands, to the bacteria that thrived in every surface he touched. He wrapped it with the cleanest fabric he could find, a strip of cotton from a t-shirt he pulled out of a donation bin on Frankfurt Avenue. He secured it with a rubber band. He did not go to the hospital. 11 blocks south, Dr. Samuel Ocasio was beginning to build a case that nobody had asked him to build. It started with photographs. Every patient who came through his ER with an unusual wound, anything that didn't match the standard presentation of injection site abscesses, Ocasio documented. He used his personal phone. The hospital had no protocol for this. There was no reporting requirement, no database, no institutional mechanism for tracking a pattern that hadn't been officially recognised yet. So he made his own. By the spring of 2020, his phone contained over 200 images. Arms with patches of blackened skin, legs with open craters where muscle tissue was visible, hands with fingers that had gone grey and rigid, the blood supply completely severed, a foot where 3 toes had fused into a single mass of necrotic tissue. He organised the photos by date and body part, creating a crude but effective visual timeline of what Xylazine was doing to the people of Kensington. The pattern was unmistakable. These wounds were not random. They were not caused by missed injections or dirty needles alone. Those produced localised abscesses, painful swollen lumps that usually responded to antibiotics and drainage. What Ocasio was seeing was different in kind. The necrosis was spreading, often appearing far from the injection site. It was painless until the most advanced stages, which meant patients didn't seek treatment until the damage was catastrophic, and it was accelerating. The same patients who came in with a small dark patch in January returned in March with wounds that had tripled in size, the dead tissue advancing outward like an ink stain through fabric. He started sending emails to the hospital's infection control department, to the chief of surgery, to the Philadelphia Department of Public Health. He described what he was seeing, attached selected images, and requested that Xylazine-related wounds be tracked as a distinct clinical category. The responses were polite. They were also slow. The infection control department asked for more data. The chief of surgery said it sounded concerning and suggested Ocasio write up a case series for a medical journal. The health department acknowledged the issue and mentioned that they were monitoring the situation. Monitoring. The word sat in Ocasio's inbox like a stone. Then COVID arrived, and everything stopped. March 2020 transformed every hospital in Philadelphia into a crisis facility operating at the margins of its capacity. Temple University Hospital, which serves some of the poorest neighborhoods in the city, was overwhelmed. ICU beds filled. Ventilators ran short. Staff rotated through COVID wards in 12-hour shifts, wearing the same N95 masks for days at a stretch, because supply chains had collapsed. The entire public health infrastructure of the city, every epidemiologist, every policy analyst, every dollar of flexible funding, pivoted toward a single pathogen. Xylazine did not pause for the pandemic, it accelerated. The lockdowns that emptied office buildings and closed restaurants had a different effect on Kensington. The drug market stayed open. It was, in a grim sense, an essential service. The thousands of people dependent on its products could not quarantine their way through withdrawal. But the support systems around those people, the outreach vans, the needle exchanges, the drop-in centres, the few clinics that accepted uninsured patients, scaled back dramatically. Elena's harm reduction van reduced its schedule from 5 days a week to 2. One of the city's largest syringe service programs closed entirely for 6 weeks. Hospitals that had previously treated wound patients with at least cursory attention now triaged them behind COVID cases. A person walking into an ER with a rotting arm was told to wait. Sometimes the wait was 4 hours, sometimes 8. Sometimes the person left before being seen, returning to the street with an untreated wound and a confirmation of what they already believed, that the system was not built for them. During those lockdown months, the xylazine concentration in Philadelphia's drug supply climbed past 70%, then 80%. Users who had previously encountered it intermittently were now exposed to it with every single use. The wounds multiplied. The amputations began to register in surgical statistics, first as a trickle, then as a current. Ocasio tracked them informally through conversations with colleagues. One surgeon at Temple told him he had performed more forearm and lower leg amputations in the first 6 months of 2020 than in the previous 3 years combined. The patients were almost all under 40. Many were under 30. Nobody was counting. That was the part that kept Ocasio awake at night, staring at the ceiling of his apartment in Fairmount while his wife slept beside him, and his phone, loaded with those hundreds of images charged on the nightstand. There was no official count. Xylazine-related wounds were not a reportable condition. They didn't appear in any public health surveillance system. They didn't have a diagnostic code. In the bureaucratic machinery of American healthcare, they effectively didn't exist. Each amputation was logged as an individual surgical event, a clinical decision made for a specific patient with a specific wound. The fact that all of these patients had the same drug in their blood, that all of their wounds followed the same progression, that the volume of cases was growing at a rate that should have triggered alarm bells in any functioning public health system, none of that was captured in any centralized record. Ocasio kept his own records. He updated his spreadsheet. He continued sending emails. The pandemic roared on, and beneath it, hidden in its shadow, the Xylazine crisis in Kensington grew in silence. Marco, during those pandemic months, existed in a narrower and narrower orbit. His world had contracted to a roughly 6-block radius. The corner where he bought, the overpass where he slept, the gas station where he used the bathroom, the donation bin where he found clothes, and the spot behind the furniture store where he sat each morning to inject. He wore a surgical mask sometimes, not out of COVID caution, but because someone had handed him a box and they were useful for keeping the wind off his face when he slept outside. His wound grew. The original crack widened into an open lesion the size of a playing card. The edges were black and hard. The centre wept fluid that soaked through whatever he wrapped it with. He changed the bandage when he could. Strips of cloth, paper towels, once a sanitary pad he found in a discarded purse. The harm reduction van, on the days it came through, gave him sterile gauze and saline packets. He used them carefully. They lasted 2 days at most. He mentioned the wound to other users on the block. Several of them had their own. One man, who everyone called Shorty, had a wound on his shin so deep that the bone was visible, a pale white ridge at the bottom of a crater of dead tissue. Shorty had been told by an ER doctor that the leg needed to come off below the knee. He had left the hospital and returned to the corner. He was still there 3 weeks later, the bone still visible, using every day. Marco heard this and felt something he couldn't name. Not surprise, not fear exactly. Something closer to recognition. The understanding that the trajectory Shorty was on was his own trajectory, just a few months behind. The wound on his forearm was a preview, a trailer for a film he hadn't agreed to star in but couldn't walk out of. He had one thought that stayed with him, persistent and unwelcome, surfacing every time he looked at the bandage on his arm. Isabella was 7 now. She would start 2nd grade in September. Carmen had sent him a photo of her in a new backpack, purple, with a cartoon astronaut on the front. Marco had stared at the photo on his phone for a long time, zooming in on his daughter's face, her smile wide and uncomplicated, her hands gripping the straps of the backpack with the seriousness of a child embarking on something important. He saved the photo. He did not call. One evening in October 2020, he unwrapped his forearm to apply fresh gauze and found that the wound had changed overnight. The necrotic tissue, previously flat and dry, had deepened. A small pocket had formed beneath the surface, a cavity where the dead tissue had separated from the living tissue below it. He could press the edge and feel the skin shift over the hollow space underneath. Something was breaking down in there, layers separating from each other in a process that his body could no longer reverse. He needed a doctor. He knew this. The gap between knowing and going was 11 blocks, a waiting room, an intake form he couldn't fill out because he had no address, a triage nurse who would assess him and assign him a number, and a wait that could last until his withdrawal set in, with enough force to drive him back to the corner before anyone in a white coat ever touched his arm. 11 blocks. It might as well have been 1,000 miles. That same week, Dr. Ocasio received a call from a colleague at the CDC. Not a response to his emails, but a separate inquiry from a researcher who had noticed an unusual pattern in Philadelphia's overdose death data. Xylazine was appearing in post-mortem toxicology reports at rates that were alarming even by the standards of a city that had led the nation in overdose deaths for years. The researcher wanted to know if Ocasio was seeing anything unusual in the ER. Ocasio almost laughed. He pulled up his spreadsheet. He described the wounds, the amputations, the patients leaving against medical advice to avoid withdrawal, the surgical teams performing debridements on people they knew would be back in weeks with the same wound, worse. He described Kensington streets. He described what was in the bags. The CDC researcher listened. She asked if he had published any of this. He said he hadn't had time. She asked if he could present his findings at an internal briefing. He said yes. The briefing was scheduled for January 2021. By the time it happened, the Xylazine prevalence in Philadelphia's drug supply had crossed 90%. Marco's wound had reached his wrist, and Nina Delgado, 3 blocks away, had stopped removing the bandage on her ankle entirely, not because the wound had healed, but because the last time she unwrapped it, what she saw beneath made her hands shake so violently that she couldn't rewrap it alone. She asked Elena, the harm reduction worker, to do it for her. Elena did. She cleaned the wound with saline, applied antibiotic ointment, and rebandaged it with steady, practiced hands. Then she walked back to the van, sat in the driver's seat, and pressed her forehead against the steering wheel for a full minute before starting the engine. She had seen what was under the bandage. She had measured it with her eyes. The wound on Nina's ankle was now larger than her fist, and at its deepest point the tissue had receded far enough to reveal the pale gleam of tendon, a structure that was never meant to see daylight, now exposed to the air of a Kensington sidewalk on a Wednesday afternoon in January, while the wind blew trash down the gutter and the line at the corner reformed for the afternoon rush. Eleanor drove 3 blocks, pulled over, and called Dr. Ocasio's direct number. She told him what she had seen. She told him the patient wouldn't come to the hospital. She asked him what she was supposed to do. The silence on the other end of the line lasted 5 seconds. It felt like an hour. Ocasio told Elena to keep the wound clean, keep it covered, and keep trying. There was nothing else he could say. He could not force a patient to come to the hospital. He could not send an ambulance to pick up someone who hadn't called for one. He could not perform surgery on a sidewalk. The distance between what he knew needed to happen and what was actually possible, that gap was where people like Nina lived, and it was widening every week. He hung up the phone and went back to the ER. 3 patients were waiting with wounds. The first had already been triaged. The second was sitting in the hallway with his leg propped on a chair, a blood-soaked bandage around his calf, scrolling through his phone with the patience of someone who had waited in this hallway before and expected to wait again. The third was asleep on a gurney, the wound on her hand visible even from across the room, a blackened crater between the thumb and index finger that had eaten through enough tissue to expose the tendons controlling her grip. This was a Wednesday, a regular Wednesday in the emergency department of a hospital, 11 blocks from the largest open-air drug market in the United States. Ocasio treated them. He debrided the dead tissue, prescribed antibiotics, scheduled follow-ups he knew most of them wouldn't keep. Then he sat down at his computer and opened the presentation he'd been preparing for the CDC briefing. 64 slides, 212 photographs, wound progression timelines, toxicology correlations, a graph showing xylazine prevalence in Philadelphia's drug supply, rising in a curve so steep it looked like the upslope of a cliff. The briefing happened in late January 2021 over a video call. 14 people attended, CDC researchers, a representative from SAMHSA, 2 officials from the Philadelphia Health Department, a handful of academic toxicologists. Ocasio presented for 45 minutes. He showed the photographs. He walked through the data. He described what Kensington looked like from inside an emergency room that was seeing more Xylazine wounds in a single week than most hospitals see in a year. The response was measured, concerned, non-committal. Several attendees asked for more data. One suggested forming a working group. Another mentioned that funding cycles for emerging drug threats were structured around annual appropriations, and that any new allocation would take 12 to 18 months to process. The meeting ended with a round of thank yous and a promise to reconvene in the spring. 12 to 18 months. Ocasio closed his laptop and stared at the wall of his home office for a long time. Outside, Philadelphia was still under partial COVID restrictions. The vaccine rollout was just beginning. The public health system was stretched so thin that a crisis affecting tens of thousands of drug users in a single neighborhood could not compete for bandwidth against a pandemic affecting millions. He understood the math. He also understood that every month of delay meant more tissue lost, more limbs lost, more people pushed past the point where intervention could do meaningful good. He went back to work the next morning. The wounds were waiting. While Ocasio fought the bureaucracy, the drug itself was moving. By mid-2021, the DEA's National Forensic Laboratory Information System, NFLIS, the database that tracks what substances are found in drug seizures across the country, was registering xylazine in samples from regions that had never seen it before. It appeared in Baltimore, which shared supply chains with Philadelphia and had a heroin market nearly as large. It surfaced in Connecticut and Massachusetts, where fentanyl had already replaced heroin as the dominant street opioid. It reached Ohio and West Virginia, states still reeling from the prescription opioid crisis that had decimated their rural communities a decade earlier. Then it jumped further. San Francisco, Los Angeles, Houston, Detroit, Chicago. Each report followed the same pattern. First a handful of detections, then a steady climb, then a flood. The percentages varied by city, but the direction was universal. Xylazine was entering the national fentanyl supply, and it was doing so with a speed that caught even veteran drug policy researchers off guard. The mechanism of spread was brutally simple. Fentanyl production in the United States is dominated by Mexican cartels, primarily the Sinaloa cartel and the Jalisco New Generation cartel, who import precursor chemicals from China and press the finished product in labs scattered across Mexico's northern states. These organizations operate supply chains of extraordinary reach and sophistication. When a new cutting agent proves effective in one market, when it increases customer dependence, extends the product's perceived effect, and costs virtually nothing, that information propagates through the network like a signal through a wire. Philadelphia was the proof of concept. The rest of the country was the rollout. Xylazine was not being added at the street level. It was being mixed into the fentanyl at the source, in the same labs where the fentanyl was pressed into powder or formed into counterfeit pills. By the time a bag reached a corner in Kensington or a dealer's hand in San Francisco, the xylazine was already inside. Nobody along the distribution chain needed to know what it was or how it worked. It was simply part of the product now, as standard as the filler powders and binding agents that had always been used to stretch the supply. This meant something that few people outside the drug policy world fully grasped. There was no opt-out. A person buying fentanyl on the street in 2022 had no reliable way to avoid xylazine, even if they knew about it, even if they tested for it, even if they desperately wanted a xylazine-free product. In most major cities, that product no longer existed. The market had shifted beneath their feet. The drug they were dependent on had been fundamentally altered, and the alteration came with consequences: wounds, dual withdrawal, naloxone-resistant overdoses that they had never signed up for. Marco Reyes did not sign up for it. Neither did Nina Delgado. Neither did the estimated 7.5 million Americans who used illicit opioids in 2022, a population the size of a mid-range European country, scattered across every state, every demographic, every income bracket, exposed to a veterinary tranquilizer that most of them had never heard of and none of them had chosen. In Kensington, the visible toll was impossible to ignore for anyone standing on the ground. But the data that would have made the crisis undeniable to people in offices and hearing rooms and budget committees, that data was still fragmentary, still delayed, still trapped in the slow machinery of public health surveillance. Drug overdose statistics in the United States are reported with a lag of roughly 12 to 18 months. The numbers that made headlines in early 2022 reflected deaths from late 2020 and early 2021. They were already outdated by the time they were published. This meant that policymakers making decisions about funding and response were operating with information that was, at best, a year and a half behind the reality on the street. The crisis was moving at the speed of a supply chain. The response was moving at the speed of a government spreadsheet. Marco's arm was moving at the speed of necrosis. By the spring of 2022, his wound had reached a stage that the medical literature categorized as full-thickness tissue loss. The blackened skin, the weeping subcutaneous layer, the exposed muscle, all of it had progressed to the point where the wound could no longer close on its own. The body's healing mechanisms require blood flow, and the xylazine had strangled the microvasculature so thoroughly that the tissue surrounding the wound was compromised even before it visibly died. New dead tissue formed at the edges of the old dead tissue. The wound advanced centimetre by centimetre, following the path of the damaged blood vessels like fire following a fuse. He went to the ER, not by choice but by necessity. The wound had begun to smell in a way that made other people on the block move away from him, and the skin above his wrist, which had been intact a month earlier, was now darkening in a pattern he recognized from the lower part of his arm. He was losing ground. The disease was climbing. He waited 9 hours. A physician's assistant examined his arm, measured the wound, ordered blood cultures and an X-ray to check whether the infection had reached the bone. It hadn't. Not yet. She prescribed oral antibiotics, gave him a supply of sterile dressings, and told him to return in a week. She noted in his chart that he had no fixed address, no insurance, and no primary care provider. She flagged him for a social work consult. The social worker was handling 47 active cases that week and did not reach Marco's file before he was discharged. He filled the antibiotic prescription at a pharmacy on Allegheny Avenue, using a Medicaid card he'd obtained with Elena's help 2 months earlier. He took the pills for 3 days, experienced nausea so severe that he vomited twice within an hour of each dose, and stopped taking them. The nausea compounded the withdrawal sickness in a way that made the mornings unbearable. He chose the option that allowed him to function. He went back to the corner. The antibiotics sat in their bottle on a windowsill of the abandoned building where he sometimes slept. 24 pills, neatly arranged in their blister pack, untouched and gathering dust while the bacteria in his wound multiplied in the warm, moist environment of dead tissue that was their ideal habitat. Nina's trajectory ran parallel, offset by weeks. Her ankle wound, the one Elena had been dressing every Wednesday, broke through to a new layer in April 2022. The tendon that had been visible at the wound's deepest point was now partially exposed along its entire length, a white fibrous cord running through a landscape of dead and dying tissue. Elena photographed it and sent the image to Ocasio. He called back within the hour and said, in terms that Elena would later relay to Nina in simpler language, that if the tendon dried out or became infected, Nina could lose the ability to flex her foot. The medical term was foot drop. In practical terms, it meant she would not be able to walk normally. The window for intervention was narrowing. Nina listened to this. She sat on the bumper of the harm reduction van and stared at the traffic on Kensington Avenue. The buses, the cars, the bicycles weaving between them, the ordinary motion of a city that had learned to function around the crisis in its midst, the way a river functions around a rock. She absorbed the information. She processed it. And then she asked Elena for a clean bandage, wrapped her ankle, stood up, and walked, on both feet, while she still could, back toward the corner. She didn't go to the hospital. Not that day, not the next day, not the day after. Her reasons had not changed. They had hardened. The last time she'd been to an ER 18 months earlier, she had waited 6 hours in a plastic chair in full withdrawal, sweating through her clothes, while the television in the waiting room played a news segment about the overdose crisis that featured aerial footage of the very block she lived on. She watched her own neighbourhood from above, abstracted into a statistic, narrated by a news anchor who pronounced Kensington with the slight hesitation of someone who had never been there. When she was finally seen, the doctor examined her ankle for less than 2 minutes, prescribed antibiotics, and told her she needed to stop using drugs. He said it flatly, as if this were news, as if she had somehow overlooked this option. She left with a prescription and without filling it. She did not go back. The system and the people it was meant to serve existed in a state of mutual incomprehension. Hospitals saw patients who left against medical advice, who didn't take their medications, who didn't keep follow-up appointments, and recorded these as failures of compliance. The patients saw a system that made them wait in agony, treated them with contempt, discharged them into the same conditions that had created the problem, and called it care. Neither side was wrong about the other. Both were trapped in a structure that had never been designed for a crisis of this scale, this complexity, this particular combination of addiction, poverty, untreatable withdrawal, and a drug that rotted the body from the inside while numbing it too much to notice. Ocasio understood both sides. He had worked in this gap long enough to see its architecture clearly. The missing rungs, the structural flaws, the places where people fell through not because of their own failures, but because the ladder simply didn't reach them. He had begun to speak publicly about Xylazine, presenting at conferences, talking to journalists, pushing for attention from anyone who would listen. In November 2022, a reporter from a national outlet visited Kensington with a camera crew. The footage aired in a segment that lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds. It showed the wounds, it showed the tranq lean, it showed the open-air market in broad daylight. 20 million people watched it. For 1 week, Xylazine trended on social media. People shared the images with captions expressing shock. Politicians in Washington referenced the segment in floor speeches. 2 senators sent a letter to the DEA requesting more information. A cable news panel discussed it for 6 minutes between a segment on inflation and a segment on celebrity gossip. Then the news cycle moved on, and Kensington stayed. The cameras left. The wounds remained. The price of a bag held steady at $8 to $12. The Xylazine content in the supply did not decrease by a single percentage point, and on the corner of Kensington and Somerset the line reformed every morning at dawn, populated by people whose names would never appear in a news segment, and whose wounds would never be photographed by anyone except a harm reduction worker or an ER physician who had already taken hundreds of identical pictures and stored them on a phone that was running out of memory. Among them, Marco Reyes, his arm now wrapped from wrist to mid-forearm, the smell controlled, barely, by a layer of antibiotic ointment that Elena applied on Wednesdays and that ran out by Friday. Among them, Nina Delgado, walking on a foot whose internal structures were slowly being exposed to the open air. Among them, Shorty, whose leg had still not been amputated, who still stood on that leg every morning in line, who had added a second wound on his opposite hand that was following the same trajectory as the first, and somewhere in Washington, the machinery of federal response was beginning, slowly, to turn toward Xylazine. Not because of the wounds, not because of the overdose deaths, not because of the voices from Kensington, but because the data had finally reached the desks where decisions were made. The numbers were in. The reports were filed. The evidence was sufficient. The question was what they would do with it. The answer, when it came, would stun even the people who had spent years expecting the worst from the federal response to addiction. Because what Washington was about to do with Xylazine would not save Marco Reyes. It would not save Nina Delgado. It would, in a way that nobody on Kensington Avenue could have predicted, make their lives measurably harder. The announcement was 6 months away. The wounds were not going to wait. On April 12th, 2023, the White House issued a formal designation. Xylazine combined with fentanyl was declared an emerging threat to the United States. The announcement came from the Office of National Drug Control Policy, accompanied by a press release, a fact sheet, and a statement from the drug czar that used words like urgent and unprecedented and committed. Cable news ran the story. Health policy journalists covered it. Harm reduction organizations across the country shared the news on their social media accounts, cautiously optimistic that the federal government was finally acknowledging what they had been screaming about for years. Dr. Acasio read the announcement on his phone between patients. For a moment, a brief, fragile moment, he felt something close to relief. The designation meant recognition. Recognition, in the logic of federal bureaucracy, was supposed to mean resources, funding, research grants, treatment protocols, a coordinated national response with the weight of the executive branch behind it. He read the details. The relief evaporated. The emerging threat designation was, in practical terms, a label. It came with no mandatory funding attached. It triggered no automatic allocation of resources to the cities and communities already drowning in the crisis. It did not direct the FDA to fast-track research into Xylazine withdrawal treatment. It did not regulate the veterinary supply chain through which Xylazine remained freely purchasable in bulk. It did not create a single new treatment bed, fund a single new outreach worker, or supply a single hospital with the specialized wound care resources that were needed to treat the injuries already accumulating in emergency rooms from Philadelphia to San Francisco. What it did was create a framework, a structure within which action could theoretically occur at some future date, pending further legislative action, pending appropriations, pending the slow and intricate machinery of federal policy implementation. A framework. The people on Kensington Avenue needed tourniquets, and Washington sent them a blueprint for a tourniquet factory. But the designation did something else, something its architects may not have intended, but that its consequences made impossible to ignore. By officially identifying Xylazine as a threat, the federal government created a rationale for state legislatures to act, and act they did. Within months of the announcement, multiple states began drafting legislation to classify Xylazine as a controlled substance. a scheduling action that would make possession, distribution, and use subject to criminal penalties. Ohio moved first, then Pennsylvania, then Florida. The bills varied in their specifics but shared a common logic. If xylazine was dangerous, then possessing it should be illegal. If possessing it was illegal, then people found with it in their blood or their belongings could be charged, prosecuted, and sentenced. The target of these laws was nominally the supply chain, the dealers, the distributors, the manufacturers. But criminal drug statutes do not stay aimed at their intended targets. They spread downward, pulled by the gravitational force of enforcement toward the easiest arrests, the lowest level offenders, the people most visible and least protected. On Kensington Avenue, the people most visible were the people using. The implications arrived before the laws themselves were fully enacted. Word spread through the block, through harm reduction workers, through legal aid attorneys, through the informal network of information that circulated among people who spent their days on the same corners. Xylazine was going to be scheduled. That meant anyone caught with bags containing xylazine could face additional charges on top of the fentanyl possession charges they were already exposed to. It meant drug testing programs, the kind that probation officers administered, that some shelters required, that certain treatment programs used as conditions of entry might begin screening for xylazine. A positive result could mean a violation. A violation could mean jail. The cruelty of this sat in a specific irony that was difficult to articulate in the language of policy, but immediately obvious to anyone living inside the crisis. Users could not avoid xylazine. It was in virtually everything being sold. There was no xylazine-free fentanyl available on the street. A person who was physically dependent on opioids, who faced agonizing withdrawal if they stopped using, who had no access to treatment because the wait list was 6 weeks long and the programs weren't equipped for xylazine withdrawal anyway. That person was now at risk of being criminalized for consuming a substance they had never chosen to take. They were being punished for being poisoned. Ocasio watched this unfold from the intersection of the medicine and policy, where he had spent the last 3 years shouting into a void. He had pushed for the designation. He had wanted federal attention, federal resources, federal urgency. What he got was federal attention without resources, and state-level urgency channeled into the one response that American drug policy had defaulted to for 50 years: criminalization. The drug war playbook applied to a new substance with predictable results. He wrote an op-ed for a medical journal. He argued that scheduling xylazine without simultaneously funding treatment and harm reduction would increase suffering, drive users away from the few services that existed, and produce no measurable reduction in supply. The piece was well received in academic circles. It changed nothing in the state legislatures that were already moving forward with their bills. Meanwhile, Marco Reyes was trying to get clean. The decision came not from the wound, though the wound was now severe enough that he could no longer fully extend his left arm. It came from a phone call. Carmen had called him, the first voice call in over a year, to tell him that Isabella had been asking about him. Not with accusation, not with anger. Isabella had simply asked, in the matter-of-fact way that 8-year-olds ask things, when her father was coming to the playground again. She wanted a cherry water ice. She remembered the cart on the corner. Marco stood on the sidewalk outside the gas station on Allegheny Avenue, holding his phone to his ear with his right hand because his left hand could no longer grip firmly enough to hold anything, and listened to his ex-partner relay his daughter's question. He did not cry. He stood very still, his jaw tight, his breathing controlled, and said he would try. He called a treatment hotline the next morning. The intake coordinator told him that the nearest available bed in a residential treatment program was 6 weeks away. She could put him on the wait list. She recommended that he contact his local harm reduction organization for support in the interim. She gave him a reference number and wished him well. 6 weeks, 42 days. At his current rate of use, 4 to 5 bags a day, that meant approximately 200 more injections before he could even begin treatment. 200 more doses of fentanyl mixed with xylazine, each one depositing the tranquilizer into a circulatory system already compromised, each one feeding the dual dependence that would make the eventual withdrawal more severe than anything the treatment program was likely prepared for. Because this was the second revelation buried inside the federal response, the one that didn't make the press releases or the policy briefs, but that was becoming devastatingly clear to the clinicians working on the front lines. The treatment infrastructure of the United States had been built for opioids, methadone clinics, buprenorphine prescribers, naltrexone injections, 12-step programs, residential facilities with 30-day or 60-day models. Every element of this infrastructure was designed to address opioid dependence, and for opioid dependence, it worked. Imperfectly, inconsistently, but with enough evidence behind it to justify its existence. Xylazine dependence was a different animal. There was no FDA-approved medication for it, no established protocol for managing withdrawal, no clinical guidelines that a treatment program could follow with confidence. Doctors were improvising, using clonidine to manage the blood pressure spikes, benzodiazepines for the anxiety and seizure risk, trazodone for the insomnia. Each case was an experiment. Each patient's response was different. Some stabilized, some seized, some walked out. The programs that accepted patients with xylazine exposure were discovering in real time that their existing models did not work. Patients who were successfully treated for opioid withdrawal, who received buprenorphine, who stabilized, who stopped feeling the opioid sickness, were still experiencing a second withdrawal that the buprenorphine didn't touch. The xylazine was pulling them apart from a direction the medication couldn't reach. They were restless, panicked, drenched in sweat, unable to sleep, experiencing a physiological storm that no one in the facility had been trained to manage. Many of them left, not because they wanted to use, but because the treatment itself had become unbearable, and nobody could tell them when it would end or what to do about it. Marco didn't know any of this. He knew only that the wait list was 6 weeks, that his arm was getting worse, and that his daughter wanted a water ice from the cart on the corner. He kept using, every morning, the 4:30 alarm, the kit beneath the mattress, though there was no mattress now, just a sleeping bag in an encampment beneath the Lehigh Avenue overpass. The tourniquet, the cooker, the needle, the bag with the blue star, the 30-second wait for the warmth, the hours of stillness that followed, during which the wound on his arm continued its silent, painless advance, and the treatment slot he had been promised moved one day closer on a calendar he did not have. 6 blocks away, Nina Delgado was also trying something. Not treatment. She had not reached that point, but a small private act of resistance against the trajectory she was on. She had started going to the harm reduction van not just on Wednesdays, but every day it was present, asking for wound care supplies, asking for information about what was happening to her body. Elena, who had seen hundreds of wounds by now, explained the mechanism as simply as she could. The drug was cutting off blood to the tissue. The tissue was dying. The dying tissue was spreading. The only way to stop it was to remove the dead tissue surgically, debridement, and for that, Nina needed to go to a hospital. Nina asked if there was another way. Eleanor said no. Nina asked how long she could wait. Eleanor was quiet for a moment and then said she didn't know, but the tendon was exposed, and if it dried or got infected, the damage would be permanent. Nina absorbed this. She cleaned her wound. She rewrapped her ankle. She walked back to the block. She did not go to the hospital, but she started doing something she hadn't done before. She began rationing. using less per dose, spreading her bags across longer intervals, trying to taper on her own. The withdrawal symptoms hit harder at the reduced doses, the anxiety, the sweats, the leg cramps that jolted her awake at night. But she held. For 1 week, then 2. On the 15th day, her body seized. Not a full convulsion, a sudden violent tremor that started in her hands and raced through her torso, locking her muscles rigid for 8 or 9 seconds before releasing. She was standing outside the check cashing store when it happened. She bit her tongue, blood filled her mouth. 2 people nearby caught her before she hit the pavement. Within an hour she'd used again, full dose. The seizure had answered the question she hadn't wanted to ask, whether she could manage this alone, without medical support, without medication, without anyone who understood what xylazine withdrawal could do. She couldn't. The drug had built a cage with 2 locks. Opioid dependence was one. Xylazine dependence was the other. And the key to the second lock had not been invented yet. The corner was still there. The blue star bags were still there. The morning line still formed at dawn. And somewhere in Washington, the framework was being built, the working groups were meeting, the appropriations were being discussed, all of it moving at the pace of institutions while the bodies on Kensington Avenue moved at the pace of chemistry, of blood supply, of tissue that was running out of time. Marco's treatment slot was now 3 weeks away. His wound had reached a point where the discharge from the dead tissue left a visible stain on every surface he rested his arm against. At night, in the sleeping bag, he positioned his left arm outside the fabric, exposed to the cold air, because the warmth inside the bag accelerated the smell. He stared at the underside of the overpass. The concrete above him was cracked and stained with decades of water damage. Someone had spray-painted a phone number on one of the support columns, a crisis hotline, the digits faded but still legible. Marco had seen it every night for months. He had never called it. 21 days. 3 weeks until the treatment bed opened. 3 weeks until someone in a clinical setting would look at his arm and decide what could be saved. 3 weeks in which the wound would continue to grow. The xylazine would continue to circulate, and the dual dependence would continue to deepen, making the withdrawal he would eventually face more severe than anything the program on the other end of the wait list was prepared to handle. He didn't know that yet. He would find out. The treatment bed opened on a Tuesday in late May 2023. Marco arrived at the facility, a converted office building on North Broad Street, 3 stories, brick facade, a small sign by the door that most pedestrians walked past without noticing, carrying everything he owned in a single backpack, a change of clothes, his phone, cracked across the screen but functional, the cloth pouch with his kit which he handed to the intake nurse without being asked, and the photo of Isabella in the purple astronaut backpack saved on the phone, the only image in his gallery that wasn't a text message or a missed call notification. His arm was wrapped in fresh gauze. Eleanor had dressed it that morning at the harm reduction van, her last act of care before handing him off to a system she hoped would do better than the one she operated from. The wound now extended from mid-forearm to just above the wrist, roughly 8 inches of open necrotic tissue in various stages of death. The deeper section, near the centre, had eroded through the subcutaneous fat layer entirely. The fascia, the thin, tough membrane that encases the muscles, was visible at the base of the wound, discoloured but still intact. If it held, the muscles beneath might be preserved. If it didn't, the conversation would shift from wound care to amputation. The intake process took 2 hours. Medical history, substance use history, mental health screening. A physical examination during which the attending nurse documented his wound with clinical photographs, measured his blood pressure, low, consistent with chronic xylazine exposure, and noted his weight at 138 pounds on a frame that had once carried 175. They started him on buprenorphine that afternoon. 8 milligrams, sublingual, dissolved under the tongue. The protocol called for a gradual induction over 48 hours. The buprenorphine did what it was designed to do. Within 90 minutes, the opioid withdrawal symptoms began to recede. The nausea softened. The muscle cramps loosened their grip. The bone-deep restlessness, that sensation of being unable to inhabit his own body, of every nerve demanding movement while every muscle demanded stillness, quieted to a manageable hum. For the first time in months, Marco ate a full meal. Rice, beans, chicken from the facility's kitchen. He sat in a plastic chair in the common room and chewed slowly, tasting the food, aware of a sensation he had almost forgotten. Hunger satisfied, body at rest, the chemical siege temporarily lifted. It lasted 14 hours. The xylazine withdrawal announced itself at 3 a.m. Marco woke in his bed, an actual bed, with sheets, in a shared room with 2 other men, and knew immediately that something was different from normal opioid sickness. His heart was racing. Not the gradual acceleration of anxiety, but a sudden pounding rhythm, as if his body had been shocked awake by an electrical current. His hands were trembling. Sweat soaked through his shirt in minutes, a cold, acrid sweat that smelled different from opioid withdrawal sweat. Sharper, more metallic. His chest tightened. Breathing became something he had to think about, each inhale a conscious effort, each exhale incomplete. He pressed the call button. A night staff member came. She took his vitals, heart rate 132, blood pressure spiking to a level that would require monitoring. She administered clonidine, a blood pressure medication that some clinicians had begun using off-label for Xylazine withdrawal. It helped, partially. His heart rate came down to 110. The tremors reduced but did not stop. The anxiety, a formless, sourceless panic that sat in the centre of his consciousness like a scream with no mouth, did not respond to the clonidine at all. He paced the hallway, back and forth, barefoot on linoleum, his arms wrapped around his torso because the trembling made his wound throb in a way it hadn't when the Xylazine was suppressing his pain responses. The buprenorphine was still active. The opioid withdrawal was controlled, but the Xylazine withdrawal operated on a separate track, and that track was now fully engaged, running at full speed through his autonomic nervous system with no pharmacological break available. By morning, he had not slept. The 2 other men in his room had not slept either. Marco's pacing and the sound of his rapid breathing had kept them awake. He sat in the common room with a cup of coffee he couldn't drink because his hands shook too violently to lift it without spilling. A counsellor sat with him. She told him this was expected, that the first 72 hours were the worst, that it would ease. She was guessing. Everyone was guessing. There were no clinical trials on xylazine withdrawal timelines, no peer-reviewed data on how long the autonomic storm would last, no dose-response curve that could tell a clinician whether a patient who had used xylazine daily for 4 years would experience 3 days of severe withdrawal or 3 weeks. The counsellor was offering comfort, not evidence. Marco could feel the difference. The second night was worse. The tremors escalated into spasms, involuntary contractions that seized his calves and forearms in waves, each one lasting 10 to 15 seconds, each one leaving the muscles sore and weakened. His blood pressure swung wildly, spiking and dropping in cycles that the night staff monitored every 30 minutes. At 2 a.m, he had a seizure. It happened in the bathroom. He was standing at the sink running cold water over his wrists. Someone had told him it helped with the anxiety, when his vision narrowed to a point and his body went rigid. He fell sideways, striking his left arm against the edge of the sink on the way down, The wound, barely protected by its gauze wrapping, took the impact directly. He was unconscious for less than a minute. When he came to, a staff member was kneeling beside him, calling his name, holding his head off the tile floor. Blood was seeping through the gauze on his arm where the impact had reopened the wound's margin. The pain, now unmasked by the absence of Xylazine's numbing effect, was extraordinary. A burning, tearing sensation that radiated from his forearm to his shoulder and left him gasping. They moved him to a medical observation room. A doctor examined the wound and found that the fall had damaged the tissue at the edge of the necrotic area, extending the zone of injury by roughly 2 centimetres. 2 centimetres closer to the wrist, 2 centimetres closer to the structures, tendons, nerves, the radial artery, whose compromise would make amputation unavoidable. Marco lay in the observation room, staring at the ceiling tiles, his arm throbbing, his heart still racing from a withdrawal that the facility's pharmacological toolkit could only partially address. The buprenorphine hummed steadily in his system, keeping the opioid receptors satisfied. But the rest of his body, the parts that Xylazine had rewired over 4 years of daily exposure, was in open revolt, demanding a substance that no doctor could ethically provide and no medication could adequately replace. On the 4th day, he left. He didn't announce it. He didn't argue with the staff or sign a discharge form. He simply waited until the afternoon shift change, when the hallways were briefly understaffed, walked out the front door in the clothes he'd arrived in, and turned south toward Kensington. The walk took 40 minutes. His arm hung at his side, freshly bandaged by the facility's wound care team that morning, already staining through. His legs were weak from 4 days of poor sleep and muscle spasms. The May sun was warm on his face. He barely registered it. He bought 2 bags on the corner of Somerset. Blue Star. He used in the alley behind the check cashing store, sitting on a piece of cardboard, and felt the Xylazine enter his bloodstream like a key turning in a lock. The tremors stopped. The heart rate dropped. The anxiety dissolved. His arm went numb again, the pain retreating behind the chemical wall that the drug rebuilt with each dose. Stillness. The terrible borrowed stillness that he had chased every morning for 4 years. That evening, 8 blocks north, Nina Delgado collapsed. She was standing in the usual spot, outside the check cashing store on Kensington Avenue. Early evening, the block still active with foot traffic and transactions. She'd used within the previous hour. The batch that day was stamped with a small red circle, a brand she hadn't seen before. She mentioned to another woman on the block that it felt stronger than usual. Then she went quiet. Her chin dropped to her chest. Her knees buckled. She went down slowly, almost gently, folding onto the sidewalk in a way that looked, to passers-by, like an exaggerated version of the tranq. Someone nodding off, sliding to the ground, nothing unusual for this block at this hour. But she didn't come back up. A man standing nearby recognized the difference. He knelt beside her and checked her breathing. Shallow, almost imperceptible. Her lips were turning blue at the edges. He pulled a naloxone kit from his jacket pocket, one of the thousands distributed by harm reduction organizations across the city, and administered a dose into her nostril. He waited 2 minutes. No response. He administered a second dose. Her breathing did not change. A woman who'd been watching ran to the corner and told someone to call 911. A third dose of naloxone. Nothing. The blue was spreading from Nina's lips to her cheeks. Her skin, normally olive-toned, had taken on a greyish cast. Her chest rose and fell at intervals that were growing longer. 8 seconds between breaths, then 12, then 15. The man performing rescue breathing between naloxone doses was doing everything correctly. He'd been trained by the same harm reduction organisation that employed Elena. He tilted Nina's head back, pinched her nose, breathed into her mouth, watched her chest rise. He repeated this every 5 seconds. The naloxone should have reversed the opioid component. The fentanyl should have released its grip on her breathing. It did. Partially. Somewhere in Nina's brainstem, the fentanyl's suppression of her respiratory drive was being blocked by the naloxone. But the xylazine, the component that naloxone could not touch, the alpha-2 agonist that operated through an entirely separate mechanism, continued to press down on her central nervous system. Her breathing drive was caught between two forces, the naloxone pushing it up, the xylazine holding it down. The net result was a respiratory rate too low to sustain adequate oxygen levels. Her brain was being starved. Minute by minute, second by second, the oxygen saturation in her blood was dropping below the threshold where cells begin to die. The ambulance took 11 minutes. In a city with thousands of overdose calls per year, response times had stretched. The paramedics arrived with equipment the bystanders didn't have: a bag valve mask for mechanical ventilation, supplemental oxygen, IV access for medications beyond naloxone. They intubated her on the sidewalk, establishing an airway and forcing oxygen into her lungs with a rhythmic squeeze of the bag. Her heart was still beating. That was the one thing working in her favour. The Xylazine had not stopped her heart. It had stopped her breathing, and the breathing had been partially sustained by the bystanders' rescue efforts. But partially was a measured word, a clinical word, and the measurement it referred to was the number of minutes Nina's brain had spent below an adequate oxygen level. The paramedics estimated that window at somewhere between 5 and 8 minutes. Long enough. Possibly too long. They loaded her into the ambulance, the doors closed, the sirens activated. The ambulance pulled away from the curb on Kensington Avenue, passing the line that was still active on the corner, passing the check cashing store where Nina had fallen, passing the spot where the man who had administered naloxone was still kneeling on the sidewalk, his hands on his knees, his breathing heavy, the empty nasal spray applicators scattered on the concrete around him. Nina Delgado arrived at Temple University Hospital at 7:42 p.m. Dr. Samuel Ocasio was on shift. The trauma team met the ambulance at the bay doors. The paramedics reported the details. Age 29, suspected fentanyl and xylazine overdose, naloxone administered ×3 without adequate response, estimated hypoxic interval 5 to 8 minutes, intubated in the field, vitals stabilizing but neurological status unknown. They moved her to a resuscitation bay. Ocasio was there. He saw the bandage on her ankle first, the same ankle, the same wound, the same grey-wrapped dressing he had heard Elena describe in phone calls and seen in the photograph she sent. He recognized her, not by name. He had never formally treated her, but by the wound. He had seen its progression through second-hand images for over a year. He knew the tendon was exposed. He knew she had refused to come in. He knew Elena had been dressing it every week, fighting a battle against necrosis with saline and gauze and the sheer force of showing up. Now Nina was here, not by choice, by ambulance. The team worked, ventilator connected, blood drawn, toxicology sent, CT scan ordered to assess brain function. Ocasio stood at the edge of the resuscitation bay, watching the monitors, watching the numbers, doing the arithmetic that every emergency physician does in these moments. The time without oxygen, the duration of suppressed breathing, the likelihood of meaningful neurological recovery. The numbers were not good. At 8:17 p.m., 35 minutes after arrival, Nina's heart stopped. The team initiated CPR. Chest compressions, epinephrine, a rhythm check, more compressions. They worked for 22 minutes. They restored a heartbeat twice, lost it twice. At 8:39 p.m., the attending physician called it. Nina Delgado was pronounced dead at Temple University Hospital, at 8:39 p.m. on a Thursday evening in June 2023. She was 29 years old. The cause of death, when the toxicology results returned 3 weeks later, would list acute intoxication by fentanyl and xylazine. The manner of death would be classified as accident. The wound on her ankle was never treated. The tendon exposed for months to the air of Kensington, to street dirt and bacteria, and the slow desiccation that Eleanor had fought against every Wednesday with sterile saline, was catalogued during the post-mortem examination as an incidental finding. It was not the cause of death. It was the evidence of a process that had been underway for far longer than the 11 minutes between her collapse and the ambulance's arrival. A process of systemic failure, medical and social and political, that had narrowed Nina's options one by one until the only one left was a sidewalk on Kensington Avenue and a batch stamped with a red circle that contained enough xylazine to overpower 3 doses of the only rescue medication anyone on that block had access to. Ocasio filed the chart. He walked to the staff bathroom. He closed the door. He stood with both hands on the sink and looked at himself in the mirror for a long time. Somewhere in the hospital's data system, Nina became a number. One of 1,413 drug overdose deaths recorded in Philadelphia that year. Xylazine was present in approximately 34% of them. Nina was not an outlier. She was not an anomaly. She was the statistical center of the distribution, the median case, the typical outcome, the expected result of a system that had failed to act at every single point where action might have changed the trajectory. 8 blocks south, Marco Reyes was sitting under the overpass, his arm throbbing where the wound had been aggravated by his fall at the treatment facility. He did not know that Nina was dead. He would not find out until the following morning, when he walked to the corner and found her spot empty, and the woman who usually stood beside her told him what had happened in 4 words that required no elaboration. Marco stood on the sidewalk. The morning line was forming. The Blue Star bags were being distributed from a car parked halfway down the block. The sun was climbing above the row houses on Jasper Street, the same sun that had risen over this block every morning for years, indifferent to what happened beneath it. He looked at his arm. The gauze was soaked through. The stain had spread overnight into a shape he didn't want to study too closely. Beneath the wrapping, the wound was now close enough to his wrist that he could feel a faint tingling in his fingers. Not pain exactly, but a warning, a signal from the nerves that the advancing necrosis was approaching the structures they depended on. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from Carmen. Isabella's school picture day was next week. Carmen wanted to know if Marco would like a copy. He read the message. He read it again. Then he joined the line. The outreach worker who found him was named Gerald. Not from one of the established organizations. Gerald worked for a smaller operation, a street medicine team that had started 6 months earlier with a grant from a private foundation and a converted Ford Transit van equipped with basic wound care supplies, naloxone, and a part-time nurse practitioner who made house calls on sidewalks. Gerald walked the blocks between Allegheny and Lehigh every morning starting at 6, checking on people he knew by face, distributing supplies, looking for anyone who needed immediate help. He'd been doing this for 112 days. He had already called 3 ambulances that week. He found Marco on a Saturday morning in late June, sitting against the wall of the abandoned furniture store on Gurney Street, conscious but disoriented. Marco's left arm was unwrapped. The gauze had come loose overnight and lay in a soiled coil beside him on the pavement. The wound was fully visible. Gerald had seen dozens of xylazine wounds in his months on the street, but he would later tell the nurse practitioner that Marco stopped him mid-stride. The necrosis now reached from mid-forearm to within 2 centimeters of the wrist crease. The fascia, which had been intact when Marco left the treatment facility weeks earlier, had breached in one section. a dark, wet gap through which the pale surface of the flexor muscle was visible. The edges of the wound were swollen and hot to the touch, signs of active infection spreading into the surviving tissue. Gerald knelt beside him. Marco looked at him with the flat, depleted gaze of a person who had stopped expecting intervention. Gerald told him, calmly and without urgency in his voice, that the infection in his arm was spreading, and that if he didn't get to a hospital, he was going to lose the arm. He said it simply, factually, the way Elena had once said similar things to Nina. The difference was timing. Nina had heard those words when her wound was still treatable. Marco was hearing them at the margin, the narrow, shrinking margin between salvageable and gone. Marco went. Not because he believed the hospital would help, not because his resistance had been argued away. He went because the tingling in his fingers had changed overnight into numbness. His thumb and index finger on the left hand could no longer feel the surface of his phone screen. The nerves that controlled fine motor function were being compressed or destroyed by the advancing infection, and the loss of sensation carried a message that no outreach worker or doctor needed to translate. He was losing his hand. He could feel it going. Gerald drove him to Temple University Hospital in the transit van. Marco sat in the passenger seat with his arm resting on his lap, watching Kensington pass through the window. The same blocks he had walked for 5 years, the same corners, the same storefronts, the same morning line already forming at Somerset, the same world he had inhabited since the night Tomas handed him that first bag with the blue diamond stamp. It took 8 minutes to drive what he had always thought of as an impossible distance. The ER triaged him immediately. The wound classification, open, infected, with exposed deep structures, put him ahead of the waiting room. A surgical team was consulted within the hour. They examined the arm under bright lights, probing the wound's margins with gloved fingers, testing the tissue at the edges for viability. The attending surgeon, a woman whose name Marco would not remember afterward, spent a long time examining the area near his wrist. She pressed the tissue there and watched the colour change, or not change, which told her what she needed to know about blood flow. She ordered an MRI to assess the deeper structures. The MRI showed that the infection had reached the periosteum, the thin membrane surrounding the bones of the forearm. It had not penetrated the bone itself. The tendons of the wrist were intact but compromised, surrounded by infected and necrotic tissue that would need to be removed before they could be assessed. The radial artery, the major blood vessel on the thumb side of the wrist, was still patent, open, flowing, functional. If it had been occluded, the hand would already have been unsalvageable. The surgeon presented the options. Full amputation below the elbow would eliminate the infection entirely, with high certainty of recovery. The alternative was aggressive debridement, removing all dead and infected tissue while attempting to preserve the hand and wrist. This option was riskier. If the debridement failed to clear the infection, or if the remaining tissue could not support healing, amputation would follow anyway, potentially under less controlled circumstances. The success rate for limb salvage in cases this advanced was difficult to estimate. No large-scale clinical data existed for Xylazine wound outcomes. The surgeon was operating on experience, judgment, and a limited body of case reports from colleagues at other Philadelphia hospitals who had faced similar decisions. Marco chose to keep his arm. The surgery was scheduled for the following morning. They admitted him overnight. They managed his withdrawal, buprenorphine for the opioid component, clonidine and hydroxyzine for the Xylazine symptoms. The combination was imperfect, but more carefully titrated than what the residential treatment facility had attempted. A nurse checked his vitals every 2 hours. The Xylazine withdrawal still came, the racing heart, the sweating, the anxiety that coiled in his chest. But the hospital setting provided something the treatment program hadn't: continuous monitoring and the ability to adjust medications in real time. When his heart rate spiked past 120 at midnight, they added a low-dose benzodiazepine. It brought him down to 95. He slept in fragmented intervals of 30 to 40 minutes, which was more than he had managed during his previous attempt at treatment. The surgery lasted 3 hours and 20 minutes. The surgeon removed tissue from an area spanning approximately 6 inches of his forearm, cutting away everything that was dead or dying layer by layer until she reached margins that bled, because bleeding meant blood supply, and blood supply meant life. The fascia was partially resected. One of the superficial flexor tendons had been so damaged by infection that it was removed entirely. 2 others were preserved but would require months of physical therapy to regain function. The wound was left open, a technique called negative pressure wound therapy, covered with a specialized dressing connected to a small vacuum device that drew fluid from the wound bed and promoted the growth of new tissue from below. Marco woke from anesthesia with his arm intact, bandaged, drained, diminished but present. He could see his fingers protruding from the edge of the surgical dressing. He tried to move them. The thumb and index finger responded weakly. The middle finger didn't move. The ring and little fingers twitched. He stared at them for a long time, flexing what he could, testing the boundaries of what remained. The hospital kept him for 11 days. During that time, the wound care team changed his dressings daily, monitoring the wound bed for signs of new tissue growth or recurring infection. The buprenorphine was stabilized at 12 milligrams. The xylazine withdrawal symptoms peaked around day 4 and began a slow, uneven decline that the medical team tracked, with hourly vital signs and a symptom checklist that had been adapted from alcohol withdrawal protocols, because no xylazine-specific assessment tool existed. A social worker visited on day 3. She was not the same one who had been assigned his case during his earlier ER visit. That social worker had since left the hospital, burned out after 2 years on a caseload that had grown by 40% without a corresponding increase in staff. The new social worker, a young woman with a clipboard and a lanyard full of resource cards, sat at Marco's bedside and walked through the options. Long-term residential treatment, transitional housing, Medicaid enrollment, wound care follow-up, buprenorphine maintenance, physical therapy for the hand. Each option existed. Each one had a wait list, an eligibility requirement, a geographic constraint, or a gap in service that would require Marco to navigate bureaucratic systems while managing a healing surgical wound and a dual dependence that had been partially treated but not resolved. The social worker wrote down phone numbers and program names on a sheet of paper that she left on his bedside table. Marco counted 17 different numbers, 17 calls to make, 17 intake processes to complete, 17 chances for the system to either catch him or let him slip through. He made 4 of the calls from his hospital bed. 2 went to voicemail. 1 connected him to an intake coordinator who told him the program was at capacity and suggested he call back in 2 weeks. The 4th, a long-term residential facility in West Philadelphia that combined buprenorphine maintenance with wound care and gradual reintroduction to daily living, had a bed available, not immediately, in 9 days. 9 days. He could wait 9 days. The hospital discharge was planned for day 11. The math was tight. 2 days between leaving the hospital and entering the residential program. 2 days in which he would need somewhere to stay, something to eat, daily wound care, and the continued supply of buprenorphine that was keeping his opioid withdrawal at bay. 2 days that could hold if the bridge between hospital and program was built carefully. 2 days that could collapse if it wasn't. The social worker arranged a bridge plan. Buprenorphine prescription filled at a pharmacy near the residential facility. a visiting nurse scheduled for wound care on both interim days, a bed reserved at a medical respite shelter, a facility specifically for people experiencing homelessness who required ongoing medical care after hospital discharge. The respite shelter was 12 blocks from the residential program. It had 24 beds. It had a waiting area with a television and a coffee machine. It had staff who checked wound dressings and administered medications. Marco was discharged on a Wednesday. He took a hospital transport van to the respite shelter. He checked in. He sat on the edge of his assigned bed, narrow, firm with clean sheets, and looked at the wall. His left arm was in a sling to protect the wound site. His fingers protruded from the bandage, visible but largely immobile. The vacuum device had been removed before discharge. The wound was now covered with a standard dressing that needed to be changed every 12 hours. The room was quiet. 4 beds, 2 of them occupied by men Marco didn't know. The window faced a courtyard with a single tree. It was late June. The tree was full and green. Marco watched it for a while, the leaves shifting in a breeze he couldn't feel through the glass. He did not go back to Kensington. Not that day, not the next day. On the 3rd day, the residential program called to confirm his admission. He took a bus to West Philadelphia, carrying his backpack, his phone, and a discharge packet from the hospital that included wound care instructions, a buprenorphine prescription schedule, and a referral for physical therapy that he would need to begin within 6 weeks to have the best chance of recovering function in his fingers. The residential program was different from the first treatment facility. It was smaller, 30 beds instead of 90. The staff included a wound care nurse who had spent 2 years treating Xylazine injuries and who changed Marco's dressing with a precision and familiarity that he found, against all expectation, comforting. The withdrawal protocol combined buprenorphine with clonidine, gabapentin for the nerve pain, and trazodone for the insomnia. It was not a published protocol. It was assembled from clinical experience, shared informally among physicians who had been forced to improvise because no official guideline existed. The xylazine withdrawal came in waves. The first week was the worst. Nights of broken sleep, mornings of elevated heart rate, afternoons of an anxiety that sat in his body like a low electrical current. But the waves grew smaller. By the 2nd week, his resting heart rate had dropped below 90. By the 3rd, he slept 5 consecutive hours for the first time in years. The number felt enormous. 5 hours, a continent of rest. His wound healed slowly. The tissue at the base of the wound bed began to granulate, a medical term for the formation of new, healthy tissue, pink and slightly bumpy, growing upward from the deepest layers to fill the space left by debridement. The wound care nurse measured it weekly. The area of open tissue shrank by approximately 15% in the first month. At that rate, full closure would take 4 to 5 months, possibly longer. The scar would be significant. The functional loss was already permanent. The removed tendon, the nerve damage, the stiffness that would limit his grip and his ability to rotate his wrist. Marco would never work construction again. His left hand, once strong enough to pour and smooth wet concrete for 8 hours a day, could no longer close fully around a handle. The thumb worked. The index finger worked, weakly. The rest was partial at best. He would need to find different work, a different use for his body, a different relationship with the hands that had been his primary tools for his entire adult life. He called Carmen from the residential program's shared phone. He asked about Isabella. Carmen told him she was doing well in school, that she'd made a friend named Sophia, that she had started drawing pictures of animals and taping them to the refrigerator. Carmen paused, and then she asked Marco how he was. He told her he was in a program. He told her about the surgery. He did not describe the wound. He said his arm was healing. He said he was going to try. Carmen said she would bring Isabella's school picture to him if he wanted. He said yes. She said she would come on Saturday. Across the city, the crisis continued without pause. The summer of 2023 brought no reduction in xylazine prevalence. The DEA's quarterly reports showed continued spread into new markets, the Pacific Northwest, the Upper Midwest, regions of the South that had previously been spared. Harm reduction organizations adapted where they could. Xylazine test strips became more widely available. Some programs trained outreach workers in basic wound care, a skill set that had never been part of harm reduction's traditional toolkit, but that the crisis demanded. Wound care kits were distributed alongside naloxone and clean syringes, each kit containing sterile gauze, saline packets, antibiotic ointment, and a printed card with instructions for cleaning and dressing a necrotic wound. Dr. Acasio was part of this adaptation. He had partnered with Elena's organization to launch a mobile wound care clinic, a van equipped with examination supplies, dressing materials, and a telemedicine connection to a surgeon at Temple who could review photographs and provide guidance in real time. The clinic operated 3 days a week, parking at different locations along the Kensington corridor, treating wounds that would otherwise go untreated until they became surgical emergencies. Funding came from private donations and a small grant from a local foundation. There was no federal money. The emerging threat designation had produced a framework, and the framework had produced working groups, and the working groups had produced reports, and the reports sat in digital folders on government servers while Ocasio bandaged arms in a parking lot. He treated between 15 and 25 patients per shift. Some were new, most were regulars, people whose wounds he had been tracking for months, measuring, photographing, dressing, watching either improve slightly or worsen dramatically depending on factors that were only partially within his control. He carried a notebook in his coat pocket where he recorded initials, wound dimensions, and treatment notes. The notebook was his third since starting the mobile clinic. The first two were full. He still had Nina's file in the hospital system. He looked at it once, on a quiet evening in the ER, scrolling through the sparse documentation. The intake note from the night she arrived, the resuscitation record, the time of death. There was no photograph of her wound in the medical chart. The wound had never been formally treated. It existed only in Elena's phone, in Ocasio's memory, and in the post-mortem report that described it with clinical detachment as a 10 by 7 centimetre area of full-thickness necrosis with exposed deep tendon, 10 by 7 centimetres, slightly smaller than a postcard. Elena still drove the van on Wednesdays. She still parked on the same block, still distributed supplies, still knelt on sidewalks to clean and dress wounds. Nina's spot outside the check-cashing store was now occupied by someone else, a younger woman, early 20s, who leaned against the same wall and who had a wound forming on her left hand that Eleanor had been watching for 3 weeks. It was still small, still early, still at the stage where intervention could make a difference. Eleanor dressed it every Wednesday. She gave the woman clean bandages and antibiotic ointment. She told her about the hospital, about the wound care van, about the options that existed. The woman listened. She did not go to the hospital. She had her reasons. They were the same reasons Nina had, the same reasons hundreds of others had. The same reasons that would continue to keep people away from the care they needed until the care itself changed enough to meet them where they actually were, not where the system wished they were, not where policy documents assumed they would be, but on the sidewalks, in the encampments, at the corners where the morning line formed and the bags were sold, and the wounds grew beneath bandages that were changed once a week if they were lucky. Marco stayed in the program. 4 weeks, then 8. The cravings came in surges, triggered by smells, by sounds, by the particular quality of late afternoon light that reminded him of the hours he used to spend in the tranquilline, suspended between consciousness and oblivion. He rode them out. Some days the riding was white-knuckled, his right hand gripping the arm of a chair while the urge passed through him like a current. Some days were easier. The staff told him that the xylazine cravings would diminish over time. Nobody could tell him exactly how much time. He began physical therapy in August. A therapist worked with his left hand twice a week, guiding him through exercises designed to rebuild strength and range of motion in the fingers that still responded. He squeezed a soft rubber ball. He picked up coins from a tabletop. He practiced gripping a pen. The progress was measurable in millimeters, a slightly firmer squeeze, a slightly wider spread of the fingers, a slight reduction in the time it took to close his hand around an object. The therapist noted each gain in a chart. Marco noted each one in a way that had nothing to do with charts. On a Saturday in August, Carmen brought Isabella to the residential facility. They sat in the visiting area, a room with couches and a coffee table, and a window that looked out onto a street in West Philadelphia that was quieter than any street Marco had lived on in 5 years. Isabella was 8.5. She'd grown. Her hair was longer. She carried a folder of drawings, animals mostly, rendered in crayon with the confident imprecision of a child who drew constantly. She showed each one to Marco: a cat, a dog, a horse. A bird she said was an eagle, but that looked more like a large chicken. Marco held the drawings with his right hand. His left rested in his lap, the surgical scar visible below the rolled cuff of his sleeve, the fingers curled in a partial fist that he could not fully open or close. Isabella looked at his hand. She asked if it hurt. He told her not anymore. She placed one of her drawings on his left palm and carefully folded his fingers around it. She told him he could keep it. It was the eagle. He kept it. But the story does not end with Marco Reyes holding a drawing in a visiting room in West Philadelphia. It does not end at all. Because outside that room, outside that facility, outside the fragile bubble of recovery that Marco inhabited for those weeks and months, the machinery that had produced his wounds and Nina's death, and the 1,400 other deaths in Philadelphia that year was still running. The xylazine supply remained unregulated at the veterinary level. The chemical precursors continued to flow from manufacturers in China and India, through intermediaries, into the hands of the organizations that mixed them into fentanyl at scale. The federal working groups continued to meet. The state-level criminalization bills continued to advance. The treatment infrastructure continued to operate without a single FDA-approved medication for xylazine withdrawal. And on the streets of Kensington, the morning line continued to form at dawn, populated by people whose wounds were growing beneath bandages that nobody but a harm reduction worker would ever change. One question remained, hanging over all of it like the cracked concrete of the overpass where Marco had once slept. The question was not whether the crisis would end. It was whether the next crisis, the one already forming in the supply chain, already detectable in the toxicology reports, already circulating through the veins of people who didn't yet know what they were taking, would arrive before anyone had figured out how to manage this one. The answer was already in the data. It was already in the lab results. It was already in the blood. The woman from the opening of this story, the one who arrived at Temple University Hospital with no name in the system, with an arm blackened from wrist to elbow, with a smell that cleared the hallway, had a name. It was found later in the pocket of the jacket that a nurse had placed in a plastic bag beneath her gurney. Her ID said Marisol. She was 31. Dr. Acasio had treated her before. 7 months earlier she had come into the same ER with an abscess on her forearm. A standard one, the kind that responds to antibiotics, the kind that heals. He had drained it, prescribed a course of medication, and told her to come back for a follow-up in 10 days. She never came back. The next time he saw her, the abscess was gone. In its place was something that antibiotics could not touch, a wound that had started where the abscess had been and expanded outward in every direction, fed by the Xylazine circulating through her blood with every dose she took in the 7 months between that first visit and the night she arrived by ambulance, unable to speak her own name. The surgeon saved part of her arm, not all of it. The tissue below the wrist was unsalvageable. The blood supply had been destroyed so completely that the hand was already dead when she arrived, the fingers cold and grey and unresponsive. They amputated at the wrist. The remaining forearm required 3 separate debridement surgeries over 2 weeks. The wound was closed with a skin graft taken from her thigh. Marisol left the hospital 32 days after she arrived. She was discharged to a shelter. Ocasio added her chart to the digital file where he kept the records of every Xylazine wound patient he had treated. The file now contained over 400 entries. Some had recovered, some had lost limbs, some had died. Most had simply disappeared, discharged from the hospital and never heard from again, absorbed back into the streets or the shelters or the encampments, carrying their wounds with them like luggage they hadn't packed. The night Marisol was admitted, that ordinary Tuesday, the one that opened this story, Ocasio had stood in the hallway and known that tomorrow would be worse. He had been right. Tomorrow was worse. So was the day after that, and the week after that, and the month after that. The trajectory had not bent. The curve on his spreadsheet had not flattened. Each day brought new patients, new wounds, new faces that arrived in the ER with the same progression, the same toxicology, the same gap between what medicine could offer and what the crisis demanded. But there was something else in the data now, something new. In the fall of 2023, toxicology labs in Philadelphia began flagging an unfamiliar compound in overdose samples. It wasn't fentanyl, it wasn't xylazine, it was medetomidine, another alpha-2 adrenergic agonist, another veterinary sedative, chemically similar to xylazine but significantly more potent. A dose of medetomidine that would sedate a large dog could suppress a human's breathing to the point of death. And like xylazine, it did not respond to naloxone. The first confirmed cases appeared in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, then Baltimore, then Chicago. The pattern was identical to the early spread of xylazine, a handful of detections, a gradual increase, a trajectory that anyone watching could project forward with grim certainty. Medetomidine was cheaper than xylazine, stronger per milligram, and equally available through unregulated chemical supply chains. It was the next iteration, the next product upgrade. The next competitive advantage in a market that optimized for potency and dependence without regard for what it left behind. Ocasio read the lab reports. He recognized the shape of what was coming. He had seen this before, not the specific drug, but the pattern. A new adulterant enters the supply. Clinicians on the ground detect it months before the data reaches policymakers. Warnings are issued. The warnings move through bureaucratic channels at the speed of institutions. The drug moves through supply channels at the speed of commerce. By the time the policy response materializes, the crisis has already metastasized, and the response arrives calibrated for a problem that has since evolved into something worse. He was watching it happen again, in real time. From the same hallway, in the same hospital, in the same neighborhood where he had watched Xylazine arrive, establish itself, and consume the bodies and lives of thousands of people, while the system that was supposed to protect them debated frameworks and scheduled working group meetings and drafted legislation that would punish the victims for the crime of being poisoned. He went back to work. He always went back to work. The wound care van was parked outside the hospital that morning, Eleanor at the wheel, the back stocked with gauze and saline and naloxone, and the small, insufficient arsenal of supplies that stood between the people of Kensington and the full, unmediated impact of what was being sold on their corners. Ocasio grabbed his coat and walked to the van. They drove to Kensington Avenue together. They parked at Allegheny. They opened the doors. The line was already there. It was a Tuesday morning, October. The air was cool. On the corner of Kensington and Allegheny, the open-air market was operational, the sellers in position, the buyers filing through. A new batch had arrived overnight. The bags were stamped with a small cartoon crown. Inside was powder. Inside the powder was fentanyl. Inside the fentanyl was xylazine, and inside some of the bags, not all of them, not yet, but enough to register in the lab results that would come back weeks later, there was something else, something newer, something stronger, something that the people buying the bags had no name for, no test strip for, no way to detect. They didn't know. They stood in line in the early light, hands in pockets, shoulders hunched against the morning chill, each of them carrying a body that was both the customer and the product, dependent, altered, marked by wounds visible and invisible, tethered to a supply chain that stretched from chemical factories on the other side of the world to this specific corner on this specific block in this specific city, the final point of sale, the place where global commerce and individual biology met and transacted their business in wax paper envelopes sold for the price of a sandwich. Among them, a young woman with a bandage on her left hand. The wound beneath it was still small, still new, still at the stage where someone, a doctor, a nurse, an outreach worker with a van full of gauze, could make a difference. Eleanor would see her on Wednesday. She would clean the wound. She would dress it. She would tell her about the hospital, the clinic, the options. The woman would listen. She might go. She might not. Marco Reyes was not in the line. He was in West Philadelphia, in a room with a window, holding a rubber ball in his left hand, squeezing it with whatever strength his 3 working fingers could produce. The eagle drawing was taped to the wall above his bed. His phone sat on the nightstand, the screen showing a text from Carmen confirming that Isabella would visit again on Saturday. His arm bore a scar that would never fully fade, a topography of loss etched into his skin, mapping the exact contour of what Xylazine had taken and what the surgeons had managed to save. He was alive. He was not healed. He was somewhere in between, a place without a clinical term, without a discharge code, without a box on any form, a place where recovery and damage coexist in the same body, the same hour, the same breath. The story should end here. It wants to end here, on a man holding a rubber ball, on a drawing of an eagle, on a Saturday visit from a daughter who remembered the cherry water ice. But the story doesn't get to end, because 2 miles east the line is still forming. The bags are still being sold. The powder still contains what it contains. And the next name, the next Marco, the next Nina, the next Marisol, is already standing on that corner, already holding out a hand, already waiting for a small wax paper envelope that will enter their bloodstream and begin its work on the tissue they cannot see, the tissue that feels nothing, the tissue that is already, right now, starting to die. Nobody has told them. Nobody's required to.